Hello everyone, I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first night in my new apartment, I convinced myself the sounds were just the building settling. By the third night, I knew better. There's a difference between the random creaks of an aging structure and the deliberate, measured cadence of footsteps. Someone or something was pacing the hallway outside my door at 2:11:13 a.m. Not that the building manager would admit it. "You're the only tenant on the 7th floor, Mr. Hayes," she had assured me with that plastic smile when I signed the lease. Perfect privacy, just as you requested. She'd handed me the keys with a flourish, as if bestowing a gift rather than closing a transaction on the cheapest unit in the complex. The isolation had been the selling point. After my divorce, I craved anonymity, a place where I could rebuild without the constant reminder of failure pressing in from all sides. The 7th floor of Blackwood Apartments sat at the end of a neglected cul-de-sac, far enough from downtown to be affordable, but close enough that I could still make my shifts at the hospital without much commute. The building itself was a relic from the 1930s. All Art Deco details worn down by decades of neglect, with more empty units than occupied ones. That first week, I attributed the sounds to imagination, the mind's way of filling silence with familiar patterns. But as October bled into November, the noises grew more distinct. The footsteps acquired a personality, sometimes hurried, as if late for an appointment. Other times slow and ponderous, pausing occasionally outside my door before continuing down the corridor toward the emergency stairs that hadn't been used in years. Judging by the rust on the push bar, I began documenting the occurrences in my phone's Notes app. It helped maintain some illusion of control of rational analysis. Midnight to 1 a.m. was usually quiet. The activity began around 1:30, reached its peak at 2:15, and tapered off by 3. The pattern repeated with enough consistency that I found myself waking just before it started, my body developing a new circadian rhythm around the disturbances. The whispering started during the third week. I first noticed it on a Tuesday night while drifting between sleep and wakefulness. The voices, at least 3 distinct tones, conversed in hushed urgency. Right outside my door, I couldn't make out words, just the rhythmic rise and fall of conspiratorial exchange. My mouth went dry as I strained to listen. The bed sheets wrapped around my fists in unconscious tension. The first time I investigated, I spent 5 minutes building up the courage to open the door. The brass knob felt ice cold against my palm as I turned it with excruciating slowness. Trying to minimize any sound, when I finally yanked the door open, the hallway stretched empty in both directions, the vintage wall sconces casting pools of anemic yellow light across faded carpet. The silence was absolute, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I started setting up my phone to record while I slept. Each morning I would review the footage, and each morning I found nothing but occasional static or the distant hum of the building's ancient heating system. Yet the sounds continued growing. Bolder, a sharp rap on the bathroom wall while I showered, 3 quick knocks against the living room ceiling at precisely 2:33 a.m. The dragging scrape of what sounded like furniture being rearranged in the supposedly vacant apartment above mine. The fingerprints were what finally broke me. I noticed them one morning as I was leaving for work, smudges on the inside doorknob that caught the light at just the right angle. At first I assumed they were mine, though I couldn't recall touching the door with dirty hands, but upon closer inspection they were too small. The pattern all wrong. They circled the knob completely, as if someone had gripped it from behind for hours, fingers gradually sliding down the metal as they stood there waiting. My heart hammered against my ribs as I studied those ghostly whirls. The implication sent a wave of nausea rolling through my stomach. Something had been inside my apartment while I slept. The violation of that thought crawled across my skin like insects. I changed the locks that afternoon, paying extra for a rush installation from a locksmith who looked at me with barely concealed judgment when I insisted on both a deadbolt and a chain. I bought a wedge doorstop and camera system I couldn't really afford. I even purchased a baseball bat. Though I hadn't played since high school that night, the building fell into an unnatural quiet. No footsteps, no whispers, no knocks. just the hum of electronics and the occasional distant siren from the city. I lay awake until dawn, the new bat within arm's reach, jumping at every creak and pop from the heating vents. The silence lasted 3 nights long enough that I began to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing if stress and isolation had manufactured a haunting where none existed. The building manager's concerned expression when I'd asked about other tenants now seemed less dismissive and more worried about my mental state. On the 4th night, I woke to the sound of scratching, faint, persistent, coming from inside the walls. It moved in irregular patterns, sometimes stopping for minutes before resuming from a different location. The sound followed me as I moved through the apartment, always emanating from whichever room I wasn't in. My security cameras picked up nothing but empty rooms and undisturbed furniture. I began to map the strange occurrences, logging times and locations in a notebook that grew increasingly chaotic. With observations, the scratching appeared most often near electrical outlets. The temperature dropped noticeably before the whispering began. The hallway footsteps followed the same path night after night, always ending at the emergency exit, but never triggering the alarm that should have sounded when the door opened. Sleep deprivation eroded my certainty at work. I caught myself zoning out during patient handovers, my mind replaying the previous night's disturbances on loop. My supervisor expressed concern about my bloodshot eyes and trembling hands. I offered vague explanations about insomnia and promised to see someone about it. Knowing I wouldn't, researching the building's history became an obsession. I dug through microfiche at the public library, scrolled through decades of local newspaper archives, even reached out to a local historian who specialized in the city's architecture. The Blackwood had once been a hotel before being converted to apartments in the 1960s. Nothing in its past suggested tragedy or violence, no suicides, no murders, no mysterious disappearances that might explain a haunting. The only oddity was a brief mention in the 1974 article about the building's renovation. The 7th floor had been closed for remodeling that was never completed. According to the piece, residents had complained about disturbances that the owner attributed to structural issues requiring attention. The floor had remained vacant until the current management company purchased the building in 2018. I confronted the building manager with this information. Her smile faltered as I pressed for details about the 7th floor's history. She eventually admitted that I wasn't the first tenant to report strange occurrences, but insisted they were just old building problems that maintenance was addressing when I asked why the rent was so much lower than comparable units. She changed the subject the night after our conversation. I returned to find my apartment door slightly ajar. I was certain I'd locked it, had developed an almost compulsive habit of checking the lock 3 times before leaving. My heart pounded as I nudged the door open. With my footbat raised defensively, everything looked undisturbed at first glance, but as I moved through the room, small discrepancies emerged. My toothbrush had been moved to the opposite side of the sink. Books on the shelf had been rearranged. Their spines no longer aligned the photo of my ex-wife and me. The one I kept meaning to put away, but never did, had been turned face down. Most disturbing of all, my notebook detailing the disturbances lay open on the kitchen counter, though I distinctly remembered placing it in my bedside drawer. Someone had added a single line in handwriting. Not my own, "We were here first." My hands trembled so violently I could barely dial my brother's number. The call went to voicemail. I tried a friend next, then another. Growing increasingly desperate as each call went unanswered, it was as if the world beyond my apartment had ceased to exist, leaving me alone with whatever presence had invaded my home. That night, I barricaded myself in the bedroom, pushing the dresser against the door and wedging chairs under both window locks. The bat lay across my lap as I sat on the edge of the bed, light on television droning at low volume. Anything to fill the silence with human sounds at precisely 2:13 a.m. The power went out. The sudden darkness hit like a physical blow. The emergency lights in the hallway should have activated, but not even their faint glow seeped under my door. The darkness was absolute, a void that pressed against my eyeballs with tangible weight. My breath came in shallow gasps as I fumbled for my phone. The screen illuminated with pain. F. Brightness. The battery at 177%. I activated the flashlight function and swept the beam around the room. The familiar contours of furniture offered momentary comfort until the light caught something that didn't belong, a handprint on the ceiling directly above my bed as my gaze fixed on that impossible mark. The first knock came not from the hallway or the walls, but from inside my closet. I froze, muscles locked in primal terror. The second knock followed, then a third, establishing a steady rhythm that matched my racing heartbeat. The closet door began to rattle in its frame, the cheap wood flexing inward as if under tremendous pressure. My throat constricted. I tried to call out to demand identification from whatever lurked behind that thin barrier, but produced only a strangled whimper. The rational part of my brain insisted no one could have gotten into the closet. I would have seen them. The primal part knew better. The pounding accelerated, the door shuddering with each impact. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds before being broken by the soft click of the closet latch. Releasing the door swung open with excruciating slowness, revealing nothing but hanging clothes and stacked storage boxes. My phone's light illuminated every corner, confirming the emptiness. I exhaled shakily, wondering if the wind from the building's ventilation system could have. The whispers erupted from all directions. Simultaneously, dozens of overlapping voices hissing unintelligible words from inside the walls. Above the ceiling, beneath the floorboards, the temperature plummeted. My exhaled breath suddenly visible in the beam of light. The dresser blocking my bedroom door began to slide with a grinding screech, pushed by an unseen force. I scrambled backward until I hit the headboard phone, clutched in a death grip, as I swept the light frantically around the room. The battery indicator flashed red 15%, then 14%. The power draining at an impossible rate, the voices grew louder, almost but not quite resolving into comprehensible speech. As the dresser completed its journey across the floor, the doorknob began to turn. I watched paralyzed as it rotated completely to the left, then to the right, testing the mechanism, finding it unlocked. The door began to open. My phone died in the perfect darkness that followed. I heard footsteps enter my room, multiple sets approaching from different angles. The mattress depressed slightly as weight settled at its foot. The air grew thick with the scent of dust and something older like paper left too long in a damp basement. A hand brushed my ankle. I broke, then lunging blindly across the bed, swinging the bat in wild arcs that connected with nothing but air. I collided with the wall, then reoriented myself and charged toward where I remembered the door being. My shoulders slammed into the frame. As I stumbled into the hallway, the emergency lights flickered weakly, revealing empty space in both directions. I ran toward the stairs, bare feet slapping against cold tile behind me. A chorus of footsteps gave pursuit, gaining ground. With each stride, I hit the stairwell door at full speed, nearly pitching headlong down the concrete steps. I descended in a controlled fall, one hand on the railing, the other still gripping the bat above me. The door slammed open again, the footsteps now a thundering cascade. The lobby stretched before me like salvation, its glass doors offering a view of streetlights and passing cars. I crossed the faded carpet at a sprint, reaching for the push bar. It didn't budge. I slammed against it again, then tried pulling. Instead of pushing, the doors remained immovable, as solid as the wall around them. Through the glass, I could see people walking past, oblivious to my plight. I pounded on the transparent barrier, screaming for help. No one turned. No one heard the footsteps reach the bottom of the stairs. I spun around, pressing my back against the unyielding door, raising the bat in trembling hands. The lobby stood empty. I waited. Muscles tensed for an attack that didn't come. Minutes dragged by in silence. Eventually, I gathered enough courage to cross back to the stairwell, peering cautiously up the concrete shaft. Nothing moved in the shadows. I tried the front doors again. They opened effortlessly, admitting a rush of cold night air that raised goosebumps along my arms. I stepped outside, half expecting some force to pull me back in. Nothing. Did I spent what remained of that night in my car, parked under the harsh fluorescence of a 24-hour gas station. When morning came, I returned only long enough to pack essentials, performing the task with frenetic speed while daylight streamed. Through the windows, as I was zipping my suitcase, my phone chimed with a text from the building manager moving out. "So soon, Mr. Hayes, the 7th floor won't be the same without you. The others were just getting to know you. I abandoned the lease, forfeiting my security deposit without complaint. The management company never contacted me about the remainder of my contract. Sometimes I drive past the Blackwood compelled by a fascination. I can't explain the 7th floor. Windows remain dark, but occasionally I glimpse movement behind the glass, a shifting of curtains, the suggestion of a silhouette, according to the building's website. The 7th floor remains unoccupied, yet at night, lights flicker on and off in windows that should be empty. And sometimes when I sit in my car across the street, I see a familiar figure moving from room to room in what used to be my apartment. A man about my height and build performing the mundane rituals of daily life. His face is always turned away from the window, but I know what I'd see if he turned around. The same hands that left those dusty prints on my doorknob now operate his limbs, the same voices that whispered outside my door now control his vocal cords. They were there first after all, and they've been looking for new tenants for a very long time. The first night I heard it, I convinced myself it was just the house settling old buildings, make noise, they breathe, they creak, they whisper to themselves in the dark. But this wasn't the familiar symphony of aging wood and pipes. These were footsteps deliberate, measured directly above my bedroom where nothing should exist except empty space and roof. I had signed the lease 3 weeks ago, a steal. Really a single-story ranch-style home on the outskirts of town, far enough from neighbors to avoid their prying eyes, but close enough to civilization that I didn't feel completely isolated. The listing had been clear: 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a modest kitchen, and a living room with a fireplace. I doubted I'd ever use. Nothing about an attic, nothing about a 2nd floor, nothing about the narrow door at the end of the hallway that I had assumed was a linen closet until I opened it and found a steep staircase disappearing upward into darkness. The landlord hadn't mentioned it during the walk-through, and I hadn't asked what was there to ask. It was just storage space, cramped, dusty, filled with cardboard boxes left behind by previous tenants. The ceiling hung low, forcing me to hunch over when I first explored it, my flashlight beam cutting through. Decades of undisturbed dust modes. I closed the door and promptly forgot about it. I had no need for extra storage. My life fit neatly into the spaces below, until the footsteps started that first night. I lay rigid in my bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, tracking the slow movement above. Heel to toe, pacing the length of my bedroom, back and forth, back and forth. Each step was light but distinct, like someone trying not to be heard but unable to become completely silent. Between footfalls came another sound, the soft scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor. My rational mind scrambled for explanations: raccoons, squirrels, maybe even a stray cat that had somehow found its way in, but the movements were too deliberate, too measured for an animal, and too heavy. The next morning I climbed the stairs to the attic, my heartbeat quickening with each step. Dust covered everything in an undisturbed blanket. The boxes sat exactly as I had seen them weeks before. Nothing had been moved. No tracks marked the floor, no signs of life. Disturbed the stillness, I told myself I had dreamed it until it happened again the following night and the night after that. Each time the same pattern: footsteps, crossing back and forth, the occasional scrape of something being moved all directly above my bed. Each morning the attic looked untouched, pristine in its abandonment. By the 5th night, sleep deprivation had frayed my nerves raw. I lay awake until 3 a.m., ears straining for the first footfall. When it came, I bolted upright, sweat beading on my forehead. Despite the cool air, I grabbed the baseball bat I'd started keeping beside my bed and stalked through the house, flipping on every light as I went. The door to the attic stairwell seemed to loom larger than before. I threw it open and charged up the stairs, bat-raised adrenaline drowning out my fear. The attic was empty, silent, undisturbed. I moved between the stacks of boxes, checking corners, measuring the space with my eyes. It was too small for anyone to hide effectively, too cramped for the pacing. I'd heard the ceiling hung so low that even I at an average height couldn't stand straight. No one could walk normally up here. I spent an hour examining every inch before retreating downstairs, locking the attic door behind me. The footsteps didn't return that night, but they came back the next louder than before, this time accompanied by something new, a soft thump like something being dropped, followed by a sound I couldn't quite identify, something between a sigh and a whisper. I stopped using my bedroom, moved to the couch in the living room as far from the attic stairs as possible. Sleep came in fitful bursts, my body jerking awake at the slightest sound from above, because now the sounds weren't confined to the space above my former bedroom. They migrated throughout the attic from one end to the other. Restless and increasingly bold, I convinced a friend to stay over. Hoping for validation, asked casually if he heard anything strange during the night. He slept soundly, reported nothing unusual in the morning, and looked at me with barely concealed concern when he saw the dark circles under my eyes, the tremor in my hands. As I poured coffee, I didn't mention the attitude to him. How could I explain that a space too small for human movement somehow contained human footsteps, that boxes sat undisturbed despite sounds of furniture being dragged, that I was slowly coming undone because of what might be nothing more than the house settling? After 2 weeks, I couldn't stand it anymore. I instant called a padlock on the attic door, not to keep whatever was up there contained, but to prove to myself that nothing was accessing the space. I checked the windows in the attic. All were painted shut, sealed tight. For what looked like decades, no entry point existed except the stairs that night. The sounds were muffled but unmistakable footsteps, movement, and something new, a rhythmic tapping like fingers drumming impatiently against wood. My skin crawled with each tap, each footfall. My mouth went desert dry, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Morning revealed the padlock intact, undisturbed. But when I ventured up into the attic, cold dread pulled in my stomach. The boxes had been moved, not dramatically, not thrown around or opened, but rearranged in subtle ways. A stack that had been against the north wall now stood 3 feet to the left. Boxes that had been stacked 3 high were now in rows of 2. I told myself I was mistaken. Memory is fallible. Stress distorts perception. I took photos of the attic with my phone before leaving for work, determined to document any future changes. The next morning, the photos didn't match the arrangement I found. Boxes had migrated again. This time, more significantly, one was open. Its contents, old books from the look of it, spilled across the floor. The padlock remained intact, unbroken, unopened. I changed the locks on all exterior doors, checked every window. Twice convinced myself there must be another entrance to the attic. I hadn't discovered some hidden access point that would explain everything rationally. I tapped walls, measured rooms against each other, looking for inconsistencies that might reveal a secret passage. Nothing. A week later came the power outage. One moment I was watching TV, trying to drown out the now constant sounds from above, and the next I was plunged into darkness. The sudden silence was almost as startling as the blackout. No TV, no refrigerator hum, no air conditioning. And for a moment, no footsteps from above. I fumbled for my phone, turning on its flashlight. The circuit breaker was in the hallway that led to the attic stairs. I've been avoiding that hallway after dark, taking the long way around through the kitchen when I needed to use the bathroom at night. Now I had no choice. My breathing came in short. Shallow bursts as I made my way down the hall. Phone extended before me like a ward against the darkness. The beam of light bounced with my trembling hand, creating monstrous shifting shadows on the walls. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, my skin prickling with the certainty that I was being watched. The circuit break panel was just beside the attic door as I reached for it. A sound from above froze me in place. Not footsteps this time, but a single heavy thud directly above, as if something had fallen or jumped down. I looked up reflexively, then back at the attic door. The padlock was still in place, but something about the door itself seemed wrong. It took my panicked brain a moment to process what I was seeing. The door was ajar, not fully open, but cracked about an inch, despite the secured lock, a physical impossibility before I could react. Movement caught my eye. My flashlight beam had wandered to the stairs, visible through the gap in the door. There, halfway up, stood a silhouette, human, shaped but wrong, somehow too thin to. Still, it stood motionless, watching me. I couldn't make out features, just the outline against the deeper darkness. Beyond, my light seemed to stop at its edges, unable to illuminate details. My lungs seized. My heart stuttered to a stop, then exploded into a frantic rhythm. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely think past the primal terror flooding my system. The figure didn't move either, just watched, waited. The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications I wouldn't process. I blinked, it was gone. Not as if it had moved away. There hadn't been time, and I would have seen it. Retreat up the stairs. It was simply gone between one heartbeat and the next, leaving nothing but empty space where it had stood. I fled, ran out the front door in my bare feet, keys clutched in my shaking hand, and drove to a motel, called in sick to work the next day. Contemplated never returning to the house, but daylight brought forced rationality. I had a lease. Most of my possessions were there. I couldn't afford to break the agreement and find a new place, and maybe I was experiencing some sort of stress-induced hallucination, sleep deprivation. Does strange things to the mind. I knew that I returned mid-morning. Sunlight streaming through every window I could uncover. The house looked ordinary, unthreatening. The attic door was closed, the padlock secure. No gap, no sign it had ever been ajar, but when I climbed the stairs to check my carefully arranged photo, graphic evidence rendered moot because the attic had been transformed. Every box was open contents strewn across the floor, old clothes, books, papers, photographs of people I didn't recognize. Decades of abandoned possessions scattered like the aftermath of a frantic search in the center of the chaos. One item stood out, a small wooden box I hadn't seen before, positioned precisely in the middle of the floor, directly above where my bed had been open. Empty, waiting, I approached it cautiously, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight. The box was old, hand-carved with intricate patterns that made my eyes hurt. If I looked at them too long, inside was a folded piece of paper yellowed with age. My hand shook as I unfolded it, revealing a floor plan of the house. My house drawn in faded ink, but not as it was now. The drawing showed a larger structure with rooms that didn't exist, hallways that led nowhere in the current layout, and notes scribbled in margins in a cramped hand I could barely decipher. The compression is successful. Space folds upon itself when unobserved. The rooms exist simultaneously with and without. The entity remains contained, but aware it watches. Through the thinned barriers, do not acknowledge its presence. Do not let it know you can perceive it above all. Do not unlock the door. I dropped the paper, backing away until I hit the wall because I had unlocked the door, hadn't I? Not the physical padlock, but something else. Some barrier between what should and shouldn't be. By acknowledging the sounds, by searching for explanations, by looking directly at what stood on the stairs, I had unlocked something. I sleep in my car most nights. Now return to the house only during daylight hours and never venture near the attic. The landlord won't let me break the lease without losing my security deposit, and I can't afford that. So I stay in a limited capacity, watching the house watch me. The footsteps have stopped. The house is silent at all hours. The attic door remains closed, padlocked, undisturbed. But sometimes when I force myself to sleep in the house on the couch, lights blazing, I wake to find things moved, nothing dramatic. A book placed on a different shelf, a cup migrated from cabinet to countertop, my keys 6 inches from where I left them, and recently something new has started. My phone fills with pictures I never took, dozens each night. All of empty hallways, vacant rooms, unoccupied spaces in my house. Except when I look closely, they're not quite empty. In the corner of each frame, just barely visible, stands a silhouette watching, waiting, getting closer each time. I don't know how much longer I can stay here, but I'm increasingly uncertain that leaving would solve anything, because I'm beginning to suspect that whatever was contained in the attic isn't bound to the house anymore. I think it's bound to me now, and the most terrifying part, Sometimes I catch myself pacing back and forth, heel to toe, as if measuring a space much smaller than the room I'm in, as if I'm the one being compressed now, folded into something that exists both here and not here. I've started avoiding mirrors. I'm afraid of what might be looking back. The old floorboards creaked under my weight as I followed Mrs. Blackwood through the dimly lit corridor of Raven's Rest. Something about the air felt wrong, heavy and stagnant, as if it had been trapped inside these walls for centuries. The proprietor's practiced smile never reached her eyes as she handed me the antique brass key to room 7, her fingertips unnaturally cold against my palm. "Remember, Mr. Evans," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The second floor is closed for renovations. Under no circumstances should guests attempt to go upstairs." Her eyes lingered on mine a moment too long before she turned away, leaving me alone with my luggage and an inexplicable chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather outside. I'd found Raven Rest online while searching for accommodations off the beaten path for my writing sabbatical. Somewhere quiet, somewhere with character, the Victorian mansion turned in. Boasted 300 years of history in the small coastal town of Blackwater Cove. The rates were surprisingly reasonable and the promise of solitude, exactly what I needed to finally finish my novel. The online reviews mentioned the place was atmospheric and full of old-world charm descriptions that seemed innocuous. At the time, my room was spacious enough with worn but elegant furnishings that spoke of bygone eras. A 4-poster bed dominated the space, its heavy burgundy curtains absorbing what little daylight filtered through the single window. A writing desk faced the wall. Positioned beneath an ancient mirror with a tarnished silver frame, the ceiling rose high above, adorned with intricate crown molding that drew the eye to a small, circular pattern directly above the bed. The first day passed uneventfully. I spent hours at the desk, productive for the first time in months. The isolation and lack of modern distractions seemed to be working their magic. I wrote until my fingers ached to stopping only when my stomach demanded attention. Mrs. Blackwood had prepared a solitary dinner in the small dining room downstairs. She watched me eat from the kitchen doorway, her thin frame barely visible in the shadows. When I asked about the history of the house, she provided only vague references to wealthy merchants and noted that the property had changed hands many times over the centuries. My inquiries about the second floor were met with a tour reminder that it was unsafe. Due to structural concerns, the conversation died, after that leaving me to finish my meal in silence. It was during my first night that I heard them. The antique clock in the hallway had just chimed twice when I jerked awake, my heart hammering against my ribs. Something had pulled me from deep sleep, not a nightmare, but a sound. I lay perfectly still, ears straining in the darkness. At first, there was nothing but the gentle tapping of tree branches against my window and the distant crash of waves on the shore. Then I heard voices, not one, but several, engaged in what seemed to be a heated discussion. Directly above my ceiling, the words were indistinct, muffled as if coming through layers of insulation, but the cadence was unmistakably human. The circular pattern in the ceiling center appeared to amplify. The sounds almost like an acoustic design feature. My mouth went dry as I listened to the rise and fall of their tones, sometimes urgent, sometimes dropping to whispers too faint to perceive. I told myself it must be other guests, despite Mrs. Blackwood's claim that I was the only one staying at the inn that week. Perhaps she had family living upstairs or workers had arrived early for the renovations. Logical explanations existed. They had to in the morning. The memory of those voices seemed less threatening in the weak sunlight that filtered through my window. I mentioned hearing movement upstairs to Mrs. Blackwood as she served breakfast. Her hand trembled slightly as she poured my coffee, dark liquid sloshing dangerously close. Close to the cup's rim, she denied anyone being up there, explaining that the old house simply settled at night. The pipe, she added with a dismissive wave, sometimes made strange sounds that new guests mistook for voices. Her explanation seemed rehearsed, delivered with the same hollow smile that never touched her eyes. I spent that day exploring the small town, gathering local information at the Historical Society, I learned more about R's Rest than Mrs. Blackwood had shared. The building had originally belonged to a shipping merchant named Elias Blackwood. In the early 1700s, records indicated the upper floor had once housed servants' quarters. When I asked if there were any tragic events associated with the property, the elderly artist's expression darkened. She hesitated before mentioning rumors of disappeared servants and whispers of dark rituals, but quickly dismissed them as local superstition. My skin prickled as she described how Elias Blackwood had been obsessed with communicating with entities he believed existed in the spaces between worlds. That night I was prepared. I stayed awake watching the ceiling and waiting. The clock struck 2, and like clockwork, the voices began. My pulse quickened as I strained to make out words. This time I detected a pattern, what sounded like questions followed by responses, almost like an interrogation. One voice seemed to dominate deeper than the others with an authority that made my skin crawl. The conversation lasted precisely 17 minutes before abruptly stopping. Unable to contain my curiosity, I slipped from bed. My bare feet flinching at the touch of the ice-cold floorboards, I grabbed my phone for light and stepped into the hallway. The air felt different outside my room, thicker with an acrid undertone that burned the back of my throat. My flashlight revealed nothing unusual in the corridor, just faded wallpaper and the staircase leading to the forbidden second floor. The stairs creaked ominously with each step. Sweat bead on my forehead. Despite the chill at the top, landing stood a heavy oak door just as Mrs. Blackwood had described. Locked and off limits, I tested the handle, finding it immovable, pressing my ear against the wood. I heard nothing but the blood rushing through my veins as I turned to head back down. Something caught my eye, a dark substance seeping from beneath the door. My throat constricted as I crouched for a closer look. It appeared to be water, but in the beam of my flashlight it had an unmistakable reddish tint. I reached out, fingers trembling, but before I could touch it, the substance retreated, pulling back under the door as if being drawn away by some unseen force. My heart slammed against my ribs as I scrambled backward, nearly falling down. The stairs in my haste. When I reached the bottom, I glanced back up to see Mrs. Blackwood standing in the shadows of the hallway, watching me with eyes that reflected my flashlight beam like those of a nocturnal animal. She said nothing, merely shaking her head slowly before disappearing into her quarters. Sleep evaded me for the remainder of the night. My rational mind fought to explain what I'd seen. Perhaps rust in old pipes or a trick of light on ordinary water. But deep down, a primal part of me recognized that what I'd witnessed defied logical explanation. The following day, I considered checking out early, but found myself unable to leave. My fascination had evolved into obsession. I needed answers in town. I sought out more information, speaking with locals at the small pub by the harbor. Most were reluctant to discuss Raven's Rest, changing the subject or finding reasons to move away from me. One old fisherman, however, loosened by ale, leaned close and warned me in hushed tones about the Blackwood family's reputation. He spoke of generations of owners who were rumored to have discovered something in the house, a way to communicate with those on the other side. The rituals, he claimed, required vessels, willing or unwilling participants to facilitate the conversations. When I asked about Mrs. Blackwood, he grew visibly uncomfortable, muttering that she was the last of her line and tended to get attached to certain guests before I could press for clarification. He made an excuse and left his unfinished drink abandoned on the bar. That night, I set an alarm for 1:55 a.m. When it vibrated beneath my pillow, I was already awake. My body tense with anticipation, I'd hidden a small audio recorder above the crown molding, hoping to capture evidence of the voices at exactly 2 a.m. They began again, but this time something was different among the usual indistinct murmurs. I clearly heard my own name spoken not once, but repeatedly woven through the conversation like a refrain. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. The voices grew louder, more distinct, no longer muffled, but crystal clear, as if the ceiling between us had dissolved. The dominant voice issued what sounded like commands, while others responded with reluctant acquiescence. Then came a sharp sound like splitting wood, followed by the unmistakable rhythm of footsteps directly overhead. slow, deliberate steps that moved from the center of the room toward what would be the door to the second floor. The temperature in my room plummeted. My breath clouded in front of my face as I watched frost patterns form on the mirror. The footsteps stopped, and in the silence that followed, I heard a new sound. The slow turn of a key in a lock, paralyzed with fear. I stared at my room door, expecting it to swing over at any moment. Instead, there came a scraping noise from above, followed by a thud in the hallway outside my room. Something was coming down the stairs. My instincts screamed for me to flee, but my limbs refused to obey. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and paused. Then slowly they approached my door. A shadow appeared in the gap beneath it. Blocking the faint light from the hallway, the brass doorknob turned slowly back and forth. Testing I had locked it. I was certain I had locked it. Yet the mechanism clicked and the door began to open inward. Cold air rushed into the room, carrying with it the scent of salt water and decay. I finally broke free from my paralysis, scrambling backward until I hit the headboard, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. The door opened fully, revealing not Mrs. Blackwood, but an empty hallway. The air shimmered like heat waves rising from summer pavement, distorting my view as I watched, unable to look away. The shimmer coalesced, forming the vague outline of a human figure, transparent but undeniably present. A voice filled the room, the dominant one from upstairs. Though the apparition had no visible mouth, it called me by name, claiming they had been waiting for someone receptive, someone who could hear them. They needed a new vessel. It explained as Mrs. Blackwood had grown too frail for their purposes, I was ideal. Sensitive enough to perceive them, isolated enough that no one would miss me immediately. The longer I stayed, the stronger their connection to me would become until I could serve as their bridge to the physical world. In that moment, I understood why Mrs. Blackwood had seemed so hollow, so empty behind her eyes. How many years had she served as their conduit? How much of her original self remained? The figure began to advance toward my bed. My muscles screamed as I forced myself to move, lunging for the window. The latch was stiff with age, but terror lent me strength. As the cold presence reached the foot of my bed, I finally forced the window open and launched myself through it, caring nothing for the fact that I was on the ground floor but could have been much higher. I hit the damp earth with a jarring impact, rolled to my feet, and ran behind me. Voices called, not just one now, but many a chorus of entreaties and threats that pursued me down the gravel drive. I didn't stop running until I reached the town, collapsing on the steps of the closed gas station. Trembling violently in the night air, I never returned to Raven's Rest for my belongings. I called the local sheriff from a motel 30 meters away, inventing a family emergency to explain my abrupt departure. They retrieved my laptop and clothes, though Mrs. Blackwood reported that my audio recorder couldn't be found. That was 3 months ago. I've moved twice since then, changing states, changing jobs, doing everything possible to put distance between myself and Blackwater Cove. But distance isn't enough every night around 2 a.m. I wake to the sound of whispers, faint, but growing clearer with each passing week. Sometimes in the moments between sleep and wakefulness, I see frost patterns forming on my bedroom mirror. The dreams are the worst vivid scenes where I'm back at Raven's Rest, but I'm not myself anymore. I watch through my own eyes as my body moves of its own accord, walking the halls, speaking words that aren't mine to visitors who look just as I once did. Tired travelers seeking solitude, unaware of what waits for them upstairs. I've started leaving the television on all night. I've tried sleeping pills, white noise machines, even soundproofing my bedroom walls. Nothing helps. They've established a connection just as they said they would, and I fear it's only a matter of time before the whispers become clear enough for me to understand what they're asking of me before I find myself answering back. And the first time I found the bowl on the roof, I told myself it was just stress-induced forgetfulness. By the fifth time, I knew something else was happening in my new home, something that defied explanation. My hands trembled as I held the ceramic bowl, its intricate blue patterns seeming to shift under the dim hallway light. My late uncle's prized possession shouldn't have been able to migrate through locked doors, and certainly not onto the slanted roof outside my bedroom window. yet there it was again. Positioned precisely where the morning sun would illuminate its glazed surface as if demanding to be noticed. I purchased the Victorian-style home on Blackwood Lane at a price that seemed too good to be true. 3 bedrooms, original hardwood floors, a wraparound porch, and a spacious attic, all for less than comparable properties in the area. The real estate agent mentioned something about the previous owners leaving abruptly, but I was too enchanted by crown molding and bay windows to press for details. Moving from my cramped apartment into this 19th century masterpiece felt like stepping into the life I'd always envisioned for myself. The bowl was the only item I had inherited from Uncle Robert when my parents delivered it. After the reading of his will, they mentioned how odd it was that he'd specifically named me as its recipient, especially since we'd never been particularly close. I remembered seeing it displayed prominently in his study during the few childhood visits I'd made to his remote farmhouse. The intricate ceramic piece featured concentric patterns of deep cobalt blue with strange symbols etched into its base that resembled no language. I recognized I'd placed it on my mantelpiece as a respectful nod to family obligation rather than genuine appreciation. 3 days after moving in, I discovered the bowl in the garden. Shed nestled among rusted tools, I distinctly remembered placing it on the mantel the previous evening, assuming I had moved it during my unpacking delirium and forgotten. I returned it to its place the next morning. It sat perfectly centered on my kitchen island the day after, balanced precariously on the banister of the second-floor landing. Each time I returned it to the mantel, each time it migrated. Elsewhere on the 7th night, I placed the bowl in a locked cabinet in my home office. I double-checked the lock, even testing the door with several firm tugs for added measure. I positioned a chair against the cabinet and balanced my phone on the chair's edge, an improvised alarm system that would clatter to the floor if disturbed sleep came reluctantly. That night, my mind racing through rational explanations, perhaps the house was settling, causing imperceptible shifts that somehow unlocked the cabinet. Maybe I was sleepwalking for the first time in my life. Possibly I was experiencing early onset dementia like my grandmother at 3:17 a.m. I awoke to absolute silence, no phone clattering, no disturbance whatsoever. Relief washed over me until I rolled over and saw the bowl sitting on my nightstand less than a foot from my face. My heart slammed against my ribcage as I scrambled backwards, tumbling from the bed and crashing to the floor. Cold sweat drenched my t-shirt. My breath came in shallow, rapid bursts that couldn't satisfy my lungs' desperate demand for oxygen. The bowl remained motionless, its blue pattern seeming to pulse in the dim glow of the streetlight filtering through my curtains. I fled the room, spending the remainder of the night huddled on the living room sofa with every light blazing when morning came. I checked the cabinet's still-locked chair undisturbed, as if the bowl had simply phased through solid matter, desperate for answers. I took the bowl to an antiques appraiser the following day. The elderly woman examined it carefully, her magnifying glass hovering over the strange markings on its base. She explained that the piece appeared to be mid-19th century, likely of Eastern European origin, though the symbols defied her expertise in ceramics markings. When I explained my predicament, choosing my words carefully to avoid sounding deranged, her expression shifted from professional interest to guarded concern. She returned the bowl, hastily suggesting I consult with a different type of expert, one who specialized in objects with attachment issues, as she delicately phrased it that afternoon. I spent hours researching the history of my house. The local historical society provided records showing the home had been built in 1872 by a merchant named Elias Blackwood, who had made his fortune importing exotic goods from Eastern Europe. The property had changed hands numerous times over the decades, with several owners departing under unusual circumstances, sudden relocations, unexpected financial problems, or vague health concerns that necessitated moves to different climates. As I drove home, a disturbing thought surfaced. What if my uncle's bowl had some connection to the original owner of my house? The timing aligned historically, and the Eastern European connection seemed too coincidental. My stomach tightened as I remembered that Uncle Robert had been an avid collector of antiques from estate sales across the country. That night, I placed the bowl in the center of my kitchen table and simply observed it. The house felt different, Somehow, the usual creaks and settling noises seemed deliberate, as if the structure itself was communicating in a language just beyond my comprehension. The temperature fluctuated unpredictably. Certain rooms became inexplicably cold, while others grew stifling. The air felt dense, charged with a potential energy that made the fine hairs on my arms stand at attention. At midnight, I tried a different approach. I spoke aloud to the empty house, addressing whatever force might be listening. I explained that the bowl had been given to me, that I was its rightful owner now, and that I meant no disrespect by bringing it here. My voice echoed through the high-ceilinged rooms, sounding thin and uncertain, even to my own ears as the words left my mouth. The overhead light flickered briefly, and for a moment I could have sworn I felt something brush past me. Not a physical touch, but a disturbance in the air. Like the wake of something moving quickly, I barely slept that night, drifting in and out of consciousness on the living room sofa again. Each time I opened my eyes, the bowl remained on the kitchen table, visible through the doorway. By morning, exhaustion had overtaken my fear, and I fell into a deeper sleep. I awoke to a crash from the basement. Sunlight streamed through the windows, indicating late morning. My muscles protested as I rose from the awkward sleeping position and cautiously approached the basement door. The bowl was no longer on the kitchen table. The wooden stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the cool darkness below. I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers trembling against the wall when fluorescent lights flickered to life. I saw the bowl resting in the center of the concrete floor, intact, despite what had sounded like a fall. As I approached it, something else caught my attention. A section of the basement wall where the ancient wallpaper had peeled away, revealing the plaster beneath curiosity. Overwhelmed caution as I moved closer to examine the exposed wall. Scratched into the plaster were the same strange symbols that marked the base of the bowl. My breath hitched in my throat as I traced the markings with my fingertips, feeling slight indentations that suggested they had been carved. When the plaster was still wet during the original construction of the house, a sudden urge compelled me to hold the bowl up to the wall, aligning its markings with their counterparts etched in plaster. As I did, the temperature in the basement plummeted. My breath-clouded edge in front of my face and a high-pitched ringing filled my ears, drowning out all other sound. The bowl grew warm in my hands, then hot not enough to burn, but uncomfortable enough that I nearly dropped it. The symbols began to glow with a faint blue luminescence, both on the bowl and on the wall, pulsing in unison like a heartbeat. The ringing in my ears resolved into something else, a voice distant and distorted, as if traveling across a vast distance. I couldn't make out words, just emotional impressions, urgency, warning, desperation. My vision blurred at the edges, tunneling until all I could see were the glowing symbols. My knees weakened, and I sank to the floor, still clutching the bowl, unable to release it. Despite the increasing heat against my palms in that moment of connection, understanding flooded through me, not in words or images, but in pure knowledge that settled into my consciousness, as if it had always been there. The bowl had belonged to Elias Blackwood, the original owner of the house. It had been his prized possession, a vessel containing something not meant to be separated from this place. My uncle had acquired it at an estate sale decades ago, removing it from its rightful home. Now it was trying to return not merely to the house, but to something within the house, something hidden. Behind these walls, the revelation ended as suddenly as it began. The glowing symbols faded, the temperature normalized, and the bowl cooled in my hands. I remained on the basement floor, gasping for breath, my heart pounding so violently I could feel my pulse in my temples. When I finally managed to stand on unsteady legs, I noticed something I had overlooked before, a thin seam in the wall, outlining what appeared to be a small door or compartment. It took hours of careful work with tools from the shed to expose the hidden compartment. Without damaging the wall further, as night fell, I finally revealed a small cavity just large enough to hold the bowl. The interior was lined with the same symbols, creating a perfect nest for the ceramic piece. When I placed the bowl inside, it fit as if custom-made for this space. Something shifted in the atmosphere of the house immediately, a releasing of tension I hadn't fully registered until it dissipated. The persistent sensation of being watched evaporated. The strange noises ceased for the first time since moving in. I felt truly alone in the house. I sealed the compartment carefully, reapplying the wallpaper I had removed. Though I considered plastering over it permanently, something stopped me. Perhaps the same intuition that had guided me through this strange experience. Instead, I made the compartment accessible, but hidden. Respecting whatever agreement seemed to have been reached that night, I slept soundly in my bed. No longer fearing what I might find upon waking, the bowl remained in its proper place, not on my mantel as I had originally intended, but where it truly belonged. Reunited with the house it had never been meant to leave in the weeks that followed, I researched more deeply into Elias Blackwood's history, discovering accounts of his interest in arcane practices and beliefs that would have scandalized Victorian society. The bowl, I suspected, had been part of some ritual or practice meant to protect the house, or perhaps to protect others from something within the house. Whatever its purpose, restoring it to its original location had satisfied whatever force had been manipulating it. Occasionally, I still hear unusual sounds in the night, not the disruptive crashes and movements from before, but soft, almost musical tones emanating from the basement. I've come to find them comforting rather than frightening, a reminder that my home harbors mysteries. I may never fully comprehend. I've made peace with the knowledge that I don't truly own every aspect of this house. Some parts of it belong to history, to forces beyond my understanding. I am merely its current caretaker, preserving its secrets for whoever comes after me. The ceramic bowl taught me that some possessions aren't meant to be owned, they're meant to be returned. I still live in the house on Blackwood Lane. I've come to love it. Despite, or perhaps because of our unusual beginning, sometimes when I pass antique shops, I wonder how many objects sit on those shelves, desperately trying to find their way home to the places where they truly belong. And sometimes in my dreams, I see those strange symbols glowing blue in the darkness, no longer threatening but protective. Standing guard over secrets, best left undisturbed. The shadows in our apartment weren't just absences of light, they were presences. I noticed this. My third night there, when the darkness pooled in. Corners seemed denser than simple shade should be, almost viscous in its stillness. That's when I first felt the weight of unseen eyes tracking my movements across the living room. A prickling sensation crawled up my spine as goosebumps erupted across my skin, but I dismissed it as new place jitters. After all, $450 a month for a 3-bedroom near Westlake University was an absurd bargain, even for a building as decrepit as ours. We should have asked why Mike and Ethan seemed unbothered those first few days. We were all electrical engineering grad students, rational to a fault, quick to dismiss what couldn't be measured or quantified. Mike, a tall guy with perpetually unkempt hair, spent most evenings hunched over circuit boards in his room. Ethan, stockier and more sociable, was rarely home, preferring the library or his girlfriend's place across town. This left me alone in the apartment. More often than I'd anticipated, the hallway connecting our bedrooms was narrow and windowless, the yellowed paint peeling in long strips like diseased skin. 12 doors lined this corridor, 3 bedrooms, a bathroom, linen closet, pantry, and several storage spaces, all crammed together in what must have been a haphazard renovation of a once grand residence. I counted them obsessively that first week, a strange compulsion. I couldn't explain 12 doors always. 12 on the 5th night. I woke at 3:17 a.m. to the unmistakable sound of a door slamming shut. My heart instantly kicked into a sprint, hammering against my ribs. As I lay frozen under my sheets, the sound had come from the hallway, but both roommates were home and asleep. I strained my ears in the darkness, barely breathing, waiting for footsteps or voices that would indicate an intruder. Nothing came but silence, heavy and expectant. After 10 minutes of paralyzed listening, I forced myself to investigate. My mouth had gone desert dry, each swallow. Painful as I eased my bedroom door open, the hallway stood empty, all doors firmly closed. The air felt wrong, several degrees colder than it should have been, with a metallic tang that coated my tongue. I checked both roommates' rooms, finding them soundly asleep, then verified every door and window was locked. Sleep eluded me until dawn painted my window gray over breakfast. I casually asked if anyone had gotten up during the night. Both shook their heads, exchanging puzzled glances. Ethan suggested old buildings settle in strange ways, pipes knock wood contracts. Mike nodded in agreement, mouth full of cereal. The matter was dismissed, but the incident marked the beginning of escalating disturbances. The random door slamming became regular, always between 3 and 4 a.m. I jolt awake, heart-racing, skin slick with cold sweat, only to find the hallway empty and all doors shut. My roommates complained of similar experiences, dark circles forming under their eyes, as sleep became increasingly elusive. We blamed the building's age, the wind anything rational. Then came the cold spots, pockets of frigid air that materialized in closed rooms. Regardless of the thermostat setting, walking through them felt like plunging into ice water. My breath clouding visibly for the seconds it took to pass through these cold zones never appeared in the same place twice, migrating throughout the apartment like hunting predators. 2 weeks in the bathroom sink began turning on by itself. The first time it happened, I was alone studying in my room when the distinctive squeak of the faucet handle turning caught my attention. My stomach tightened into a hard knot as I approached the bathroom, finding water streaming into the basin. Though no one had been near it, I twisted the handle shut with trembling fingers, noticing how unnaturally cold the metal felt against my skin when I reported this to my roommates. Their forced laughter couldn't mask their unease. We agreed to check the plumbing, but none of us actually did. I began documenting the occurrences in a journal, partly to maintain some semblance of scientific debt attachment, partly to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. The entries grew increasingly frantic. Day 17. Dew slammed 3 times last night. Found kitchen chairs rearranged this morning. Mike and Ethan deny moving them. Day 19. Cold spot in my bedroom lasted over an hour. Temperature dropped to 46 degrees Fahrenheit according to my thermometer, while the rest of the room remained at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Impossible day, 21 sink. Turned on twice, second time water was scalding hot steam. Filling the bathroom, discovered deep scratches inside the basin that weren't there. Before sleep deprivation began taking its toll during lectures, my attention drifted as shadows in the periphery of my vision seemed to move independently. My academic performance suffered. Professors emailed concerns. I blamed insomnia but couldn't explain its cause without sounding deranged. Mike was the first to break. I found him one morning staring vacantly at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, knuckles white as he gripped the sink's edge. When I asked if he was okay, he turned to me with bloodshot eyes and whispered that something had been whispering his name all night from inside the walls. He moved out that afternoon, offering no explanation to our landlord, leaving his security deposit behind Ethan, and I tried to rationalize Mike's departure as stress-induced paranoia, but our nervous laughter rang hollow in the apartment that now felt cavernous with one less occupant. We silently agreed to spend more time in common areas, neither willing to admit we were afraid of being alone the night after Mike left. I woke to what sounded like fingernails dragging slowly across the ceiling above the living room. The scraping noise raised every hair on my body as I lay paralyzed, my pulse throbbing in my temples. The sound continued methodically back and forth, as if something was pacing above us, something heavy after an eternity of that rhythmic scratching. I forced myself from bed. My legs nearly buckled as I stood, muscles weak with fear. I found Ethan already in the hallway, face ashen in the dim light without speaking. We moved toward the living room, drawn by a compulsion stronger than our terror. The ceiling fan hung motionless, but even in the darkness we could see fresh scratches marring the blades, deep grooves carved into the wood. As if by enormous claws, the switch remained in the off position. Neither of us had touched it. The scratching had stopped the moment we entered the room, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to swallow all sound. We stood there, breathing in shallow gasps, neither willing to speak. What we both knew something was in the apartment with us, something that wasn't bound by physical laws, something that was growing stronger. Ethan broke first, stuttering that he'd be staying at his girlfriend's. Indefinitely, he packed a bag and was gone within 20 minutes, leaving me alone in the increasingly hostile space I considered following his example, but found myself unable to leave. Whether from stubborn skepticism or morbid fascination, I needed to understand what was happening that night. I sat vigil in the living room, lights blazing, armed with a baseball bat and my journal. The apartment remained still until precisely 3:17 a.m., when the temperature plummeted so rapidly my exhaled breath instantly fogged. The cold penetrated to my marrow as every door in the hallway began slamming in sequence, bang, 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 like malevolent dominoes. I sat frozen, muscles locked with terror as the slamming continued in perfect rhythm. My mind scrambled for rational explanations, pressure, differential wind patterns, but failed to produce anything convincing then. With a final thunderous slam, silence returned. The apartment resumed its normal temperature so suddenly that sweat broke out across my skin with shaking legs. I forced myself into the hallway to investigate my baseball bat clutched in white-knuckled hands. I counted the doors as I passed them, a ritual that had become compulsive, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 12, all closed. But as I turned to retreat to the living room, a flicker of movement caught my eye at the hallway's end. There, where only a BL wall had stood before, was a 13th door. My heart stuttered in my chest as I stared at the impossibility before me. The door was ancient wood, blackened with age, its surface carved with symbols I couldn't recognize, but instinctively understood were malevolent. It hadn't been there minutes before, couldn't have been there. The building's architecture made such a door a physical impossibility. Beyond it should have been the sheer drop to the alley. 3 stories below, I approached with unwilling steps drawn forward. Despite the primal fears screaming through every nerve, the wood grain seemed to shift subtly under my gaze, patterns rearranging like living tissue. My hand, moving with a will separate from my conscious mind, reached for the tarnished brass doorknob. The metal burned with cold against my palm as I grasped it. My fingers instantly numbing, a low hum emanated from behind the door, rhythmic like breathing. I stood transfixed, unable to turn the knob, yet equally unable to release it. Locked in a moment of terrible potential energy from the corner of my eye. I caught movement in the wall beside the door, the yellowed wallpaper rippling as if something was pushing against it from within. The ripples spread, traveling along the corridor's surface like waves, the walls suddenly flexible as fabric. A bulge formed, stretched, took on the vague impression of a face. Hollow eye sockets, a gaping mouth pressing outward as if trying to emerge. The sight broke my paralysis. I jerked away from the door, my numb fingers tingling painfully as circulation returned. I stumbled backward, my spine hitting the opposite wall as the bulging face receded, wallpaper smoothing as if nothing had disturbed it. The 13th door remained a dark maw in reality itself. I retreated to my room, barricading the door with my desk. Sleep was impossible. I sat with my back against the wall, eyes fixed on the door until morning light filtered through my window when I finally summoned the courage to emerge. The hallway contained only 12 doors, the 13th had vanished. Leaving no trace of its existence in the harsh light of day, I questioned my sanity. Sleep deprivation and suggestion could explain hallucinations I considered seeking psychological help, but feared the inevitable questions about substance abuse or family history of mental illness. Instead, I drove to the county records office and requested any information on the building's history. What I found shattered any hope of rational explanation. The apartment building had originally been a psychiatric hospital in the early 1900s, notorious for experimental treatments. My bedroom had once been part of the ward where the most disturbed patients were housed. The renovation into apartments had occurred after a mysterious fire in 1953. That claimed no lives but destroyed the hospital's east wing. Precisely where the 13th door had appeared, I didn't return to the apartment. I packed essential belongings into my car and checked into a motel, then emailed my professors requesting a leave of absence. My security deposit, like Mike's, remained unclaimed. 2 months later, safely relocated to a studio apartment across town, I ran into Ethan at a campus cost shop. The dark circles under his eyes had vanished, and he seemed almost embarrassed about our shared experience. He suggested carbon monoxide poisoning could explain our shared delusions. I nodded along, willing to embrace any explanation that didn't involve 13th doors or faces and walls. As we parted, Ethan mentioned offhandedly that new tenants had already moved into our old apartment, 3 of them all students looking for cheap rent. I felt a coldness spread through my chest as he wished them better luck than we had that night. I dreamed of a long corridor lined with doors, 12 visible and 1 hidden. Waiting to be manifested behind it, something patient watched and waited, existing in the boundaries between walls, growing stronger with each acknowledgement of its presence. And in the dream I understood with perfect clarity that I had never truly left the apartment. Part of me remained there, trapped in the space behind the 13th door, while something else had walked away wearing my face. I woke gasping, my body drenched in cold sweat for a moment in the disorientation between sleep and wakefulness. I could have sworn my bedroom wall rippled slightly as if something behind it had taken a deep breath. But by the time I fumbled for the light switch, the wall stood solid and innocuous. I tell myself it was just a dream. I tell myself I'm safe now away from that place. But sometimes in the darkest hours before dawn, I find myself counting the doors in my new apartment, and sometimes just for an instant I think I count one too many. VR song, the fluorescent light above my desk flickered, a staccato pulse matching the throb behind my eyes. I glanced at my watch, 9:47 p.m. 3 hours passed when the building should have emptied. Yet here I sat, the only illuminated window in a tower of darkness from the 23rd floor. The city sprawled beneath me, a constellation of lights that felt increasingly distant from my isolated position. I hadn't intended to stay this late again, but the H account wouldn't resolve itself. That was the price of independence. My small consulting practice demanded hours that larger firms distributed among dozens. The silence of the empty building had become my nightly companion, punctuated only by the hum of the ventilation system and occasional settling of the structure. Until tonight, I first noticed it while reviewing spreadsheet data. A murmur so faint I initially mistook it for traffic noise carrying up from the streets below. But as I paused, pen hovering over my notepad, the sound clarified itself. Voices, not one but several, engaged in what seemed to be a heated discussion. The sound originated from somewhere down the corridor beyond my office walls. My first thought was rational. The cleaning crew must have arrived early yet. I knew this couldn't be true. The janitorial staff worked the early morning shift, never arriving before 5 a.m. Building security had confirmed this when I'd requested my after-hours access pass. No one should be here. I returned to my work, dismissing the sounds as pipes or perhaps the elevator machinery. 10 minutes later, the voices grew louder, words remained indistinct, but the cadence suggested argument, rapid exchanges, AR rising. Inflection of frustration, then sudden drops to conspiratorial whispers. My skin prickled as I realized how clearly I could now discern multiple speakers. At least 3 distinct vocal patterns. The pen slipped from my fingers, rolling across the desk and onto the floor as I bent to retrieve it. The voices abruptly ceased. The silence that followed seemed more intrusive than the mysterious conversation had been. I straightened, listening intently, conscious of my quickened breathing when nothing resumed. For several minutes I returned to my work, though concentration now eluded me. My eyes darted to the door every few seconds. I found myself repeatedly checking my phone's clock. 10:13, 10:17, 10:22. The voices returned at 10:26, louder than before and with a new quality that sent ice through my veins. Urgency. I stood my chair, rolling back against the wall with a dull thud. The conversation outside continued, uninterrupted. I moved toward my office door, each step deliberate and soundless on the carpeted floor. With my hand on the handle, I hesitated, irrationally certain that opening the door would bring me face to face with whatever lurked beyond. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly parched, and pulled the door open in one swift motion. The hallway stretched before me, bathed in the dim blue glow of emergency lighting. Empty, every office door remained closed, each with its darkened window confirming vacancy. The voices which had been so distinct behind my closed door now seemed to recede. Becoming fainter as I stepped into the corridor, I moved cautiously down the hallway past the elevator bank toward the source of the sound, which seemed to emanate from the far end where the executive suites were located. As I approached, the voices diminished further until, by the time I reached the last office, a corner suite belonging to a financial advisor who I'd never seen, used the space sign, had fully descended. I tried the door handle, locked. Pressing my ear against the cool wood, I heard nothing but the electrical hum that permeates all modern buildings, feeling foolish. I made my way back to my office, attributing the experience to exhaustion and the strange acoustics of an empty building. Perhaps sounds from the street had somehow channeled through the ventilation system, creating the illusion of nearby voices. The explanation satisfied me until I stepped through my doorway and stopped short my chair, which had rolled back against the wall when I stood. Now sat squarely before my computer as though someone had just vacated it. My pulse quickened as I scanned the room. Nothing else appeared. Disturbed. The spreadsheets remained open on my monitor, the half-empty coffee mug still perched on its coaster. My jacket still hung on the back of the door. I approached the chair, cautiously placing my palm against the cushion to check for warmth. It felt cool, but something else caught my attention. A faint scent that hadn't been present before. Something like old paper and cologne reminiscent of my grandfather's study sleep eluded me that night. I lay in my bed, replaying each detail, rationalizing each element of the experience. By morning, I had nearly convinced myself that fatigue had distorted my perception. I must have bumped the chair as I re-entered the room. The scent was probably residual cleaning solution. The voices were undoubtedly from a neighboring building or perhaps even a television. Someone had left on in another office I considered working from home that day, but dismissed the idea as cowardice. The following evening, however, I made a point to leave by 700, gathering my files to review at home instead. For 3 days, I maintained this new schedule, departing before darkness fully claimed the city. On the fourth day, a client emergency demanded my attention well past myself and opposed curfew. By the time I'd resolved the issue, night had settled heavily outside my window. The clock on my computer read 8:57 p.m. I began packing my briefcase, determined to leave before 9, when the first whispers slithered through the silence. It began as it had before, distant and indistinct, but unlike the previous occasion, the voices escalated quickly, growing from murmurs to distinct conversation within minutes. I froze FF, still gripping a folder, halfway into my briefcase, and listened. The cadence matched what I'd heard before, but now I could almost distinguish words. Almost, but not quite, as though the speakers used a language just adjacent to English. Familiar yet incomprehensible against my better judgment, I left my office to investigate once more. This time I brought my phone recording app activated in my pocket. The hallway appeared identical to my previous expiation, empty, dimly lit, silent. Yet as I moved toward the executive suites, I noticed something I'd overlooked before: a thin strip of light beneath the door of the corner office. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached. The voices had again receded to whispers, but seemed concentrated behind that illuminated door. I reached for the handle, certain it would again be locked, and nearly stumbled forward when it turned freely in my grip. I hesitated, then pushed the door open. The room beyond lay in perfect darkness. No light shone from within. The strip I'd seen had vanished. I fumbled for the light switch and flipped it on, revealing an empty office. Dust covers draped the furniture, and a fine layer of undisturbed dust coated every surface. No one had used this space in months. I backed out of the room, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I turned to retreat to my office. Movement caught my eye, a shadow passing across the emergency exit door at the corridor's end. I called out, my voice sounding thin and fragile in the emptiness. No response came, but the exit door drifted slightly on its hinges, as though recently disturbed. My pace quickened as I returned to my office. No longer concerned with stealth, I pushed through my door, grabbing for my briefcase. Determined to leave the building immediately, I stopped short at the side of my desk. My papers, neatly organized when I'd left, now lay scattered across the surface. My computer monitor displayed not the spreadsheet I'd been viewing, but a blank screen with a blinking cursor as I watched text began to appear. one character at a time as though typed by invisible hands. WELCOMETOTHEMETING. My knees weakened, forcing me to grip the door frame for support. A chill swept through me, raising goose flesh along my arms. The cursor continued to blink after the message. Waiting for what my response, I remained frozen, watching until the screen suddenly went black, then returned to my spreadsheet as though nothing had happened. I should have left then. I should have gathered my things and never returned. Instead, curiosity, that most dangerous of human compulsions, led me to check my phone. The recording app showed it had captured 3 minutes and 42 seconds of audio with trembling fingers. I pressed play. The first minute contained only the sound of my footsteps and breathing. Then came something else, a conversation far clearer on the recording than it had been to my ears. 3 distinct voices discussed what sounded like financial figures, mentioning percentages and market projections. The exchange grew heated, one voice dominating with thinly veiled threats. Then a 4th voice entered, quiet, authoritative speaking. Only a few words that silenced the others. Immediately, the recording ended with footsteps not mine and what sounded like a door closing. I since learned the history of my building, constructed in the late 1980s. It housed several investment firms during the market boom. One firm in particular, occupying the entire 23rd floor, collapsed spectacularly in 1992. Accusations of fraud and embezzlement. Its partners avoided prosecution. The whistleblower who tried to expose them disappeared under mysterious circumstances. No body was ever found, no charges ever filed. The case went cold. I continue to work late occasionally, though never alone anymore. I hired an assistant who stays with me, safety in numbers. I tell myself the voices still come at precisely 8:57 p.m., though they never progress. Beyond murmurs when we're both present, my assistant claims not to hear them, attributing the sounds to the building's infrastructure. Sometimes when reviewing our financial records, I discover small discrepancies, figures adjusted, decimal points, moved, balances slightly altered. Each change, if left uncorrected, would benefit our clients at the expense of others. I fix these anomalies immediately, attributing them to software glitches or my assistant's inexperience. I never mention the chair that occasionally shifts position when unattended, or the scent of old paper and cologne that lingers in our office each morning last week. My assistant left early, pleading illness alone. I heard the voices rise to unprecedented clarity. I understood every word of their ghostly deliberation, the planning of financial ruin for unsuspecting clients, the calculated destruction of evidence, the casual discussion of removing obstacles as the conversation reached its climax. My computer screen flickered, displaying a message different from the first YOUKNOWTOOMUC. I didn't flee this time. Instead, I spoke aloud to the empty room, explaining that I understood their need for justice, for exposure of past wrongs, but that I couldn't be their instrument. The temperature dropped precipitously as I spoke, my breath fogging in the suddenly frigid air. When I finished, my screen flashed one final message: THNSOMEONELSEWILLBE. The building has new tenants now on the 23rd floor, a startup financial consulting firm, young ambitious people working impossible hours. I've tried to warn them about staying too late, about the dangers of solitude in that particular space. They humor me with Ahmed smiles, attributing my concerns to middle-aged eccentricity. Yesterday, the local business journal announced their first major client acquisition, the restructured descendant of that disgraced investment firm from 1992. I recognize names on their advisory board, children and grandchildren of those original partners tonight. From my new office in a different building across the street, I can see a single illuminated window on the 23rd floor. A lone figure sits at a desk working late. It's 8:56 p.m. I watch, breath held, as the minute changes. The light flickers, then stabilizes. Even from this distance, I can see the figure suddenly stiffen, head tilting as though listening. I know what they hear. I know what comes next. I turn away from the window, unable to watch. Some cycles can't be broken. Some justices can't be denied. Some voices will be heard one way or another. The silence at Pine Hollow Retreat wasn't the peaceful kind you seek when escaping the city. It was a dense, watchful silence that seemed to press against my eardrums, making me strain to hear something, anything beyond the occasional creak of timber, adjusting to the night's cold that first night. As I stared at the knotted pine ceiling of my isolated chalet, I couldn't shake the feeling that the silence was deliberate, as if the forest itself was holding its breath waiting. I'd chosen Pine Hollow specifically for its isolation after my divorce finalized, followed by the company restructuring that left me with a generous severance, but no purpose. I needed somewhere to regroup somewhere. Distant from sympathetic glances and awkward conversation, the retreat's website promised solitary cabins nestled in pristine wilderness and a digital detox experience with minimal staff interference. Perfect for a man looking to disappear for 2 weeks. The property consisted of 8 rustic chalets arranged in a loose semicircle around a small central lodge where meals were served. Each chalet sat approximately 50 yards from its neighbors, connected by winding gravel paths through dense spruce trees. Mine was second from the end, with only one neighboring cabin. To my right, the setup offered exactly what I needed: anonymity, silence, and the comforting illusion that I could simply vanish from the world's notice. My first day passed uneventfully. I hiked the properties. Trails ate dinner alone in the lodge, where the elderly owner Vernon explained that the off-season meant I was currently their only guest. The retreat would remain nearly empty until Memorial Day weekend. I welcomed the news, relieved I wouldn't need to make small talk with other vacationers that night. I fell into bed exhausted from physical exertion, sleeping more soundly than I had in months. The second night changed everything. I awoke. Suddenly at 2:18 a.m., according to the harsh red glow of my bedside clock, something had pulled me from deep sleep, a sound just at the threshold of perception. I lay perfectly still, listening there. It came again, a gentle scraping at my door, not a knock, but something more delicate, like fingernails lightly dragging across wood. My pulse quickened as I slipped from bed. My bare feet meeting the cold hardwood floor, the scraping continued, rhythmic and patient. 4 slow drags paused, then 4 more standing frozen in the center of the cabin. I contemplated my options. Logic suggested wildlife, perhaps a raccoon or something larger, drawn by the scent of the granola bars in my backpack, yet the regularity of the sound held an undeniable deliberateness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice embarrassingly thin in the darkness. The scraping stopped immediately. I grabbed the metal flashlight from my nightstand, heavy enough to serve as a weapon if needed, and approached the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob as sweat formed between my shoulder blades. Despite the night's chill, with a sudden surge of resolve, I yanked the door open. Nothing. The porch was empty, illuminated only by the half moon hanging between branches overhead. My beam of light swept across the clearing, catching nothing but underbrush and the gravel path. As I stepped fully onto the porch, a movement caught my peripheral vision. The door of the neighboring chalet was closing slowly and silently, with just the faintest click. As it latched, a wave of confusion washed over me. Vernon had explicitly stated I was the only guest. Perhaps another late arrival, yet there had been no headlights, no sound of a vehicle on the gravel drive that encircled the property. I considered marching over to investigate, but something in the deliberate slowness of that closing door made my skin prickle. Instead, I retreated inside, double-checking the lock before returning to bed, where I lay awake until dawn. Painted gray light through the gingham curtains at breakfast, I casually inquired whether another had checked in. Overnight, Vernon looked up from wiping down tables, his weathered face puzzled as he assured me that no. I remained their sole occupant. When I mentioned seeing the neighboring cabin's door close, his expression flickered briefly. Something passing too quickly across his features to identify, he answered that perhaps the wind had caught an improperly latched door. Mentioning they hadn't used that particular cabin in some time due to plumbing issues, his explanation was reasonable, yet the careful neutrality in his tone felt rehearsed. I didn't press the issue, though the encounter left a knot of unease in my stomach. That afternoon, I found myself drawn to the neighboring chalet. From the outside, it appeared identical to mine, a simple A-frame structure with a small porch and green-painted door. The windows were covered with blinds drawn tightly closed, standing before it. In broad daylight, I felt foolish for my midnight anxiety. I tested the door and found it locked further. Supporting Vernon's explanation satisfied, I continued my hike, determined to dismiss the incident. Night fell early as it tends to in densely forested areas. I'd spent the day hiking more challenging trails and returned to my cabin. Exhausted muscles pleasantly sore after a hot shower and simple dinner, I settled into bed with a paperback thriller I'd brought along around 10 as my eyelids grew heavy. I noticed a faint glow seeping beneath my door. Not my door, I realized with a jolt of adrenaline the light was visible through my window. A thin yellow line beneath the neighboring chalet door. I sat up book forgotten and watched as shadows occasionally passed across that strip of light. Suggesting movement inside my mouth went dry as dust someone was... found my tires mysteriously flat when I attempted to depart. All four simultaneously a statistical improbability that Vernon attributed to metal debris on the service road. When I sought his help, the earliest a mobile mechanic could arrive was precisely my scheduled departure day. Each night followed the same pattern, the scratching at my door around 2 a.m., the light in the neighboring cabin, the shuffling movements. I stopped investigating, instead huddling in my bed with blankets pulled tight around me as if cotton and polyester could shield me from whatever existed next door on my final morning. As I loaded my repaired car under Vernon's watchful gaze, he approached me with something clutched in his gnarled hand. "Found this while cleaning your cabin," he said, extending his palm to reveal my watch, the expensive one my ex-wife had given me for our 10th anniversary, which I distinctly remembered packing securely in my toiletry bag. "Where did you find it?" I asked, voice betraying my unease. Vernon's roomy eyes met mine directly for the first time. It was on the nightstand next door, he said quietly in the empty cabin. I snatched the watch from his palm, the metal ice cold. Despite the warmth of the morning, as I drove away, I glimpsed Vernon in my rearview mirror standing motionless in the gravel drive, watching my departure with an expression of profound relief. 3 months have passed since my stay at Pine Hollow. I've rationalized most of what happened: stress-induced paranoia, grief, manifesting as anxiety, an old man playing mind games with a vulnerable guest. Yet I cannot explain why some nights I still wake at precisely 2:18 a.m. to the sound of gentle scratching at my apartment door, or why when I check my watch, the same watch returned to me that final day. The time always reads 2:17, regardless of the actual hour. And I cannot explain why last week I received a small parcel in the mail containing a wood splinter painted a familiar shade of green with a handwritten note from Vernon. "It followed you home. I'm sorry the darkness in an empty building speaks a language of its own. It's not the absence of light that unsettles you. It's the weight of emptiness, the hollow that seems to breathe when nothing should be breathing at all. I've spent 15 years as the night caretaker at Westwood Heights, and I thought I understood every creak, every settling pipe, every whisper of the heating system coming to life, until the 7th floor began to call to me. My name is Michael Reeves, at 53. I've seen enough in life to consider myself reasonably unshakable. Divorced for 8 years, I found comfort in routine, in the predictable patterns of maintaining this 12-story residential building on the outskirts of town. The residents know me as the reliable shadow who fixes their leaking faucets, replaces their flickering hallway bulbs, and ensures the security of their homes while they sleep. What they don't know is how the building has changed, or perhaps how I have the 7th floor has been vacant for renovation for nearly 6 months. Now, a plumbing disaster had rendered all 8 units uninhabitable, with construction crews working during daylight hours to restore the apartments by nightfall. The floor should remain silent, dark, and locked. That's how it had been until 3 weeks ago. My nightly rounds are methodical. I begin at the basement at 11 p.m., checking the boiler room electrical panels and maintenance closets before ascending floor by floor. I inspect hallway lighting, emergency exits, stairwells, and common areas. A ritual performed with such consistency that my body moves through the building on autopilot while my mind wanders elsewhere. That Tuesday night, my routine was broken by a thin line of light leaking into the 6th floor stairwell from above. My pulse quickened slightly, an instinctive response to the unexpected. The 7th floor should have been dark, as it had been every night before I climbed the remaining stairs. My footfalls suddenly seeming unnaturally loud in the concrete enclosure. The hallway was bathed in the artificial glow of a single ceiling light. Approximately halfway down the corridor, all other fixtures remained dark, creating a spotlight effect on the worn carpet and half-painted walls. I stood motionless for several moments, listening for any sign of the construction workers who might have lingered beyond their hours. Nothing but the distant hum of the building systems reached my ears. I approached the illuminated section of hallway keys, jingling soft at my hip as I drew closer. Goosebumps rose along my forearms despite the building's warmth. Something felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, like walking into a room and finding all the furniture shifted 1 inch to the left. Everything looked correct but felt fundamentally altered. Then I noticed it Unit 704's door standing ajar by about 3 in. I distinctly remembered securing that door myself. The previous Friday, after the contractors had finished installing new drywall, I had checked each unit, personally ensuring they were locked for the weekend. My throat constricted as I approached. I called out, announcing myself as the building caretaker, my voice sounding strangely hollow in the empty corridor. No response came. Using my flashlight, I pushed the door further open and swept the beam across the apartment's interior. The space was gutted, exposed wall studs, wires dangling from the ceiling, plastic sheeting covering the unfinished flooring. Construction tools lay organized along one wall exactly as they should be, yet something had disturbed the thin layer of drywall dust coating the entrance. A set of indistinct marks swept across the plastic sheeting against better judgment. I stepped inside. The temperature dropped noticeably as I crossed the threshold, my breath forming a subtle vapor in the air. I blamed it on a draft from the exposed ventilation system, but even as I formed the rational explanation, a different part of my mind rejected it. This cold had a presence to it, a deliberate quality that made my skin prickle. I advanced further into the apartment, sweeping my flashlight across the skeletal room. The beam caught something unusual on the far wall, a small mark that hadn't been there during my Friday inspection. Drawing closer, I discovered a series of thin vertical scratches in the fresh drywall, each about 8 inches long. They appeared deliberate rather than accidental. 5 parallel lines grouped together like fingers had scraped downward. A subtle current of air brushed against the back of my neck. Stirring the fine hairs there, I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs, but found only the empty apartment behind me. The sensation persisted, however, a featheral touch circulating through the static air. Despite the absence of functioning ventilation, then came the sound. Distant at first, barely distinguishable from the building's ambient noise, a metallic rotation followed by a soft click. My body recognized it before my mind could process it. The sound of the apartment's front door latch. Engaging adrenaline surged through me as I rushed back toward the entrance, flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Across the unfinished walls, the door stood firmly closed when it had been opened. Moments before I gripped the handle and turned nothing. It had locked from the outside. A cold sweat broke across my forehead as I jiggled the handle with increasing force. The lock mechanism was new. I had installed it myself the previous week. It wasn't designed to lock automatically. Someone or something had to have turned the key. I called out again, louder this time, my voice cracking slightly with the strain of forced composure. I pressed my ear against the door, listening for footsteps retreating down the hallway. Nothing, just the maddening silence of the EMP empty floor. My master keyring hung from my belt, the familiar weight suddenly reassuring against my hip. I fumbled with trembling fingers, selecting the correct key and pushing it into the lock. It slid in halfway and stopped as if something obstructed it from the other side. Impossible. I had installed every lock on this floor myself. Panic began to bloom in my chest, my heart pounding so violently I could feel my shirt moving with each beam. I threw my shoulder against the door once, twice, 3 times before the frame finally splintered and gave way. I stumbled into the hallway, bracing myself against the opposite wall, gasping for breath. The corridor stood empty. The single light still burned overhead, creating islands of shadow. At either end of the hallway, I scanned both directions, looking for any sign of an intruder, but found only the silent row of closed doors staring back at me like blind eyes. When my breathing finally steadied, I examined the door I had just forced open. The lock appeared untampered with. From the outside, I tested my key again. It now slid in smoothly and turned without resistance. The door swung freely on its hinges, showing no sign of having been jammed. Moments before, I convinced myself that the lock had malfunctioned, a reasonable explanation for a newly installed mechanism. I reported it in my maintenance log and finished my rounds. Though my usual methodical pace had been replaced by hurried movements and frequent glances over my shoulder. 2 nights later, it happened again. Different unit, same floor, a light where none should be, a door that should have been locked. Standing open this time, I didn't enter, I merely closed and locked the door, making a note to check the contractor's sign-out procedure. But as I turned to leave, the unmistakable sound of footsteps pattered across the floor inside the apartment I had just secured. The following week brought more incidents. The pattern became predictable yet inexplicable. Lights activating themselves in various sections of the 7th floor. Doors found ajar that I personally had locked. Cold spots that moved through the hallway like invisible pedestrians. I began documenting everything meticulously, cross-referencing with the construction foreman, who insisted his crew was adhering strictly to protocol, never remaining after hour, always securing the floor before departure. I installed motion-activated cameras at my own expense, eager to identify the trespassers I was certain were responsible. The footage showed nothing, just empty hallways and doors that opened by themselves, locks turning without visible assistance in one particularly disturbing sequence. A shadow stretched across the wall without a corresponding figure to cast it, elongating like spilled ink before dissolving into the darkness. My sleep became fragmented, corrupted by dreams of endless corridors and doors that led nowhere. Dark circles formed beneath my eyes, and residents began to comment on my haggard appearance. I brushed off their concerns with manufactured smiles and vague references to seasonal allergies. The construction foreman noticed too. He pulled me aside one morning as his crew arrived, asking if I was feeling all right. I hesitated before mentioning the strange occurrences on the 7th floor. His expression shifted from concern to unease. As I detailed the incidents, he admitted reluctantly that several of his workers had requested reassignment from the project, citing uncomfortable feelings and unexplained equipment failures while working on the 7th floor. One electrician had quit entirely after claiming to hear someone whispering his name from inside a wall cavity. The foreman had dismissed it as job site superstition, but now he wasn't so certain those revelations should have reinforced my growing dread, but instead they provided a strange comfort. I wasn't alone in my experiences. Whatever haunted the 7th floor had made itself known to others. This wasn't madness, or at least not mine alone. Armed with this validation, I altered my approach. Instead of avoiding the floor or rushing through my inspections, I began spending more time there. I would bring a folding chair to the hallway each night, positioning myself where I could observe the entire corridor, and simply wait sometimes for hours, enduring the oppressive silence and the creeping sensation of being watched from every shadowed corner. Last night, everything escalated. I had settled into my usual surveillance position when the temperature plummeted so rapidly that my breath instantly clouded before me. The cold penetrated my uniform, seeping into my bones with an unnatural intensity that no drafty building could explain. All the department doors along the corridor simultaneously swung open, the sound of their unlatching echoing like synchronized gunshots in the confined space. I froze fingers, digging into the arms of my folding chair, unable to flee or call out from within each darkened unit. A soft blue illumination began to pulse, casting rhythmic shadows across the hallway. The light seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with organic precision. My own breathing sin ionized with it. Involuntarily, my lungs filling as the light grew stronger, emptying as it dimmed. Then I heard a sound so ordinary it became terrifying in this context. From the furthest unit came the unmistakable noise of running water, not the violent rushing of broken pipes that had originally damaged this floor, but the gentle patter of a shower in use. Steam began to billow from the doorway, rolling down the corridor toward me like a living fog. My par paralysis broke. I stood shakily, my chair clattering to the floor behind me. The sound echoed unnaturally, repeating and distorting until it resembled distant, mocking laughter. I backed toward the stairwell, unwilling to turn my back on the open doorways. The fog continued its advance, swirling around my ankles with deliberate movement within its vaporous body. I could discern shapes forming and dissolving, suggestions of faces and limbs that vanished. When direct observed, my back hit the stairwell door, and I fumbled blindly for the handle eyes still fixed on the hallway as I pushed through to the stairwell. I caught one final glimpse of the corridor standing in the steam-filled haze. Was a figure humanoid, but wrong. Somehow its proportions subtly distorted, It raised what might have been an arm in a gesture that could have been a greeting or a warning. I didn't sleep at all last night. I called in sick today. The first time I've missed work in 3 years, the construction foreman texted me this afternoon asking if I knew why his crew found all their tools arranged in perfect concentric circles in the middle of Unit 704. This morning, I didn't respond tonight. I will return to Westwood Heights, and to my duties, I will make my rounds checking each floor methodically as I have for 15 years. And when I reach the 7th floor, I know what I'll find: a light where none should be, a door that should be locked, standing open, but this time I think I'll walk in and close the door behind me, whatever waits there has been calling to me specifically. Maybe it's time I answer the darkness. In an empty building speaks a language of its own. After all these weeks, I think I'm beginning to understand what it's saying. The first message arrived at 3:17 a.m. The sudden blue glow from my phone cut through the darkness like a knife casting strange shadows across my bedroom ceiling. My own number stared back at me, identical to the one listed as me in my contacts. The text was simple: "You." I blinked, sleep evaporating from my mind. "You returned." The translation made my skin crawl. Despite the grammatical error, I didn't speak Portuguese. I had never been to Brazil or Portugal or anywhere that would justify this. Linguist slip, my thumb hovered over the screen. I typed, "Who is this?" and pressed. Send the message showed the spinning circle, then failed. I tried again. Same result, the digital void swallowed my attempts at communication, leaving only that question hanging in the air between me and or myself. I checked my call log, my message history. Nothing, no record of receiving anything at 3:17 a.m. When morning came, I contacted my carrier. The representative's voice carried the practiced patience of someone dealing with paranoid customers daily. He assured me no messages had been sent to or from my number overnight. No unusual activity whatsoever. The conversation left me with a hollow feeling in my stomach, as if I'd swallowed something cold and heavy that refused to dissolve. For 5 days, I convinced myself it had been a dream, a glitch, or some elaborate prank that would eventually reveal itself. The rational explanations I constructed felt like paper shields against the nagging dread that had taken residence in my chest. I found myself checking my phone obsessively, the screen becoming both a source of anxiety and the only window into whatever was happening. The second message came while I was brushing my teeth. "No, Saya, ainda don't leave yet." My toothbrush clattered into the sink. I nearly slipped on the bathroom tile as I lunged for my phone. Heart hammering against my ribs, the screen showed no notification. Nothing but, as I stared at it, pupils dilated in the harsh bathroom light. The message appeared on my lock screen as if materializing from thin air. My hands trembled as I unlocked the phone. The message was there then in my normal messaging app from my own number. I took screenshots, recorded a video of me scrolling through the conversation. I wasn't crazy, but when I logged into my carrier account, once again, there was no record of these exchanges. Sleep became my enemy. I would lie awake, phone face down across the room, but still, somehow feeling its presence like a malevolent entity. The soft buzz of electronics in my apartment, the refrigerator's hum, the digital clock's subtle electrical pulse took on sinister undertones. Each sound became a whisper, each shadow a potential threat. The messages continued, always in Portuguese, always from my own number, always vanishing from official records. "Al don't. V. They are coming, no. Don't trust your eyes. Remember the accident. The last one struck me like a physical blow." What accident? I had never been in any serious accident. The closest thing was a minor fender bender 3 years ago. But something about the phrase tunned into my subconscious, burrowing deeper with each passing hour. I began researching Portuguese using translation apps. Seeking patterns in the messages, the sentences were grammatically correct but oddly constructed as if translated from another language before reaching Portuguese. Or perhaps I thought during one particularly dark night as if composed by an entity that didn't quite grasp human communication. My work suffered. Colleagues noticed my bloodshot eyes, my jumpiness, whenever a phone chimed anywhere in the office. My boss suggested I take some time off after I snapped at a client during a presentation. When my phone vibrated in my pocket, I didn't tell him the real reason that I was terrified of what new message might be waiting at home. I began covering mirrors. I couldn't explain the compulsion, only that my reflection seemed subtly wrong. Eyes holding my gaze a fraction too long, movement slightly out of sync with my own. The bathroom mirror was first, then the full-length one in my bedroom. I used old sheets, securing them with duct tape, ignoring how unhinged it made my apartment look. The messages grew more frequent, more urgent. They are using your face now, don't let them replace you. The other side is leaking. I started sleeping with the lights on when I slept at all. My apartment became a fortress, blinds. Drawn doors double locked. I began recording everything. Setting up my laptop to capture video while I slept, hoping to catch what I wasn't sure, but the camera's unblinking eye provided a thin veneer of security. The recording showed nothing unusual, just me tossing and turning, occasionally checking my phone with wild, desperate movements, but watching myself sleep was its own kind of horror. There was something uncanny about seeing my unconscious body vulnerable and unaware. Sometimes I thought I could see my eyes open slightly, staring directly at the camera, though I had no memory of waking. My investigation led me down increasingly strange paths. I researched quantum physics theories about parallel universes, psychological disorders that could explain my symptoms, electromagnetic interference that might affect digital communications. Nothing provided a satisfactory explanation for messages that existed for me alone. The turning point came when I received "O paralestoi, look at the sky tonight." Something about the instruction felt different, less threatening, and more guiding. That evening, I ventured onto my balcony for the first time in weeks. The night air felt alien against my skin after so long inside above me. An aurora rippled across the sky, green and purple waves dancing where they had no business being at this latitude. My phone buzzed in my handbag. Do you see now, the aurora shouldn't have been visible here. Not in this city, not this far south. Yet there it was, undulating across the stars like a living thing. My neighbors' apartments remained dark. No one was outside pointing cameras skyward. No social media exploding with aurora sightings. Just me alone witnessing something impossible. The next message broke the pattern. It came in English. The boundary is thinning. I don't have much time. You need to understand my fingers shook as I typed a response, expecting the now familiar failure. But this time the message sent, "Who are you?" "I am you from elsewhere." Another branch. The accident split. U.S. cold. Sweat beaded on my forehead. The accident, I couldn't remember what accident I typed. The quantum computing experiment, you were there. I was there, we were the same. Until the divergence fragments of memory surfaced, a laboratory I'd never seen, equipment I didn't recognize, faces of colleagues I'd never met, yet somehow familiar like deja vu given physical form. My head throbbed with each new image. He explained the other me from some parallel reality, that an experiment had gone wrong, creating a fracture between dimensions in his world. I was a physicist working on quantum communication. The accident had split our timeline, creating divergent paths. He had been trying to reach across the divide to warn me they noticed the breach. The Guardians, they maintain the walls between realities. They're coming to seal it. Another message followed quickly, but they don't just fix the breach, they erase anomalies. People like us who have connected across boundaries, my throat-constricted lungs struggling for air that suddenly seemed too thin. How do I stop them? You can't. But you can hide. The aurora is a manifestation of the breach. When it fades, they'll come. You need to be somewhere they won't look where. Somewhere between not fully in your world. Find a leal space. I grabbed essential supplies, water protein bars, a flashlight, my phone charger. The messages directed me to an abandoned subway station at the edge of the city. The entrance was sealed with plywood and chain link, but my other self guided me to a service door that yielded to persistent pressure. The tunnel beyond swallowed me in darkness so complete it felt solid. My flashlight beam seemed to penetrate only a few feet before being absorbed. The air was stale, heavy, with decades of undisturbed dust, and something else, an electrical charge that made the hairs on my arm stand on end. "How long do I stay here?" I texted until it's safe. "I'll contact you, and if you don't." No response came. The signal bars on my phone disappeared one by one until I was truly alone. I made my way deeper into the station, finding an old Main 10M room where I set up a makeshift camp. The walls were covered in faded safety notices and what looked like mathematical equations scrolled in yellow chalk. They reminded me of quantum formulas I'd seen during my research, but more complex symbols I didn't recognize. Interspersed with the familiar time became meaningless. Underground, my phone still worked as a clock, but with no natural light. The hours blurred together. I slept when exhaustion overtook me waking to the same unchanging darkness. The only sounds were the distant rumble of trains passing on active lines far above and the occasional skittering of small creatures in the walls. On what my phone claimed was the third day, I heard something new, footsteps too measured and deliberate to be rats. I extinguished my light and pressed myself into a corner, breath-shallow heart pounding so loudly I was certain it would give me away. The footsteps passed my hiding place, paused, then continued. I caught a glimpse through a crack in the door, a figure that seemed to absorb light rather than be illuminated by it, moving with fluid grace that no human could achieve. I remained motionless until long after the sound had faded. My phone lit up with a message: "They're searching the boundaries, stay hidden." Then moments later, I found a solution. We can't stay separated forever, but we can reintegrate how I typed fingers. Clumsy with fear, the breach goes both ways. I can pull you through or push myself into your reality, but the transition would be difficult. Difficult, how our consciousness would merge. Two sets of memories, experiences, knowledge, most people's minds. Fracture, under the strain. I considered the alternative: remaining in this limbo, indefinitely hunted by entities I barely understood. What do I do? Find the central platform. There's a maintenance access panel with a red lever. When you pull it, focus on the accident. The memory you've been avoiding, it will create a quantum resonance between us. It took hours of careful movement through the darkness to find the platform. The access panel was exactly where he said it would be, hidden behind a defunct ticket booth. The lever inside was cold to the touch. Resistant as I gripped it with both hands, I closed my eyes and allowed the suppressed memories to surface. The laboratory, the humming machine, the sudden flash of light that seemed to tear reality itself. I remembered my other life, my work, my knowledge. As I pulled the lever down, electricity arced from the panel, enveloping me in blue-white light. Pain lanced through my skull as two sets of memories fought for dominance. Childhood in Boston versus growing up in Chicago, studying literature versus quantum physics. Relationships with different people who had never existed in the other's world for a moment that stretched into eternity. I was everywhere and nowhere, everyone and no one. When consciousness returned, I found myself lying on my apartment floor, phone clutched in my hand. The screen showed a message thread with my own number, but now I could see both sides of the conversation, what I had sent and what I had received. Both were mine, both had always been mine. I stood on shaky legs and approached the covered bathrobe mirror with trembling fingers. I pulled down the sheet, my reflection stared back, but now I recognized it fully. The subtle wrongness IID perceived was just the disconnection between my fractured selves. My phone buzzed one final time, my number, our number, with a simple message. "We're whole now, but the boundary remains torn. Others might find their way through." I glanced at my window where the night sky appeared normal. Stars visible between city buildings. No aurora, no visible breach. But I knew better now. Reality was thinner than anyone suspected, more permeable and somewhere beyond the veil. The Guardians were still searching. I turned away from the window and began removing the sheets from all my mirrors. I would need to see clearly from now on. After all, I knew exactly what to watch for. The fluorescent lights in the Harmon Business Center flickered with an unnatural rhythm, casting sickly shadows across the fourth-floor hallway. The constant electrical hum that permeated the building seemed to deepen as I approached the end of the corridor clipboard. In hand, something about this place had felt wrong from the moment I'd accepted the contract to assess the commercial properties. Not wrong in any way I could articulate, just a persistent gnawing wrongness that settled in the pit of my stomach and refused to dissipate. My name is Michael Reeves, commercial property assessor for Westlake County. I've spent 15 years evaluating office spaces, retail locations, and industrial properties. I know buildings. I understand their logic, their patterns, their secrets. At least I thought I did before I encountered Office 408. It began 3 weeks ago when I received the assignment to conduct a comprehensive assessment of the Harmon Business Center, a 12-story structure built in the late 1980s. The work was straightforward. Verify occupancy document, maintenance issues, assess market values, and update the county's property database. I'd received spreadsheets listing all tenants, floor plans showing every office and security AC access to the entire building. The assessment progressed smoothly through the first 3 floors, but when I reached the 4th floor and began cross-referencing my tenant list with the actual offices, I noticed a discrepancy. My system showed every office from 401 to 424, except for a mysterious 408. According to the official floor plan, there was only 408, no 408. I assumed it was a clerical error and continued my work. That Friday afternoon, I was finishing my inspection of the 4th floor when I noticed something odd. The main corridor made a sharp right turn at the end, leading to a short hallway that wasn't clearly marked on my floor plan. Following it, I discovered a door with a small tarnished plaque reading 408A in faded lettering. The inconsistency triggered my professional curiosity. This office existed physically, but not in any of the official records. I tried the handle, finding it locked. Pressing my ear against the door, I detected no sound from within. Not even the omnipresent hum of the building's ventilation system seemed to penetrate this space. I knocked, receiving no response. Something about the door's texture felt wrong against my knuckles. Not quite solid, not quite hollow. I made a note to return with a building manager. The strange office nagged at me throughout the weekend. Monday morning, I requested the complete architectural plans from the county archives and spent hours reviewing them according to every document. The hallway ended at Office 408. There was no turn, no extension, no 408. Yet I had seen it touched it when I returned to the 4th floor. The following week, I experienced the first real shock. The corridor ended exactly as the plans indicated, with a blank wall where I distinctly remembered seeing the right turn and hallway extension. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat as cold sweat beaded on my forehead. I approached the wall, running my hands over its surface. It was solid drywall painted the same institutional beige as the rest of the building, with no indication that a hallway had ever existed there. I asked the receptionist at the insurance office across the hall if she knew anything about Office 408A. She looked at me with genuine confusion, stating firmly that the hallway had always ended at that wall when I described the short extension corridor in the door. I'd seen, she suggested, I might have confused this floor with another building. Her certainty and the conviction in her eyes made my stomach tighten. I thanked her and left my hands trembling slightly as I made notes. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed the memory of seeing that door, touching it, feeling its strange texture beneath my fingers. I'd been doing this job for 15 years. I didn't confuse buildings. I didn't imagine doors. 3 days later, I was driving past the Harmon Business Center around 9:30 p.m., having finished a late assessment at a nearby property. Almost without conscious decision, I pulled into the parking garage the night security guard recognized me from my previous visits and allowed me upstairs after I explained I needed to check something for an urgent report. Due the next morning, the building felt different at night. The fluorescent lights hummed at a lower, more menacing frequency. The normal bustle of office activity was replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. The elevator carried me to the 4th floor with a jerky motion that felt deliberate, threatening. When the doors opened, I hesitated before stepping out the hallway, stretched before me, identical to how I remembered it from my daytime visits. Yet somehow altered, the shadows seemed deeper, the corners less defined. I walked slowly toward the end of the corridor. my footsteps echoing unnaturally in the empty space, and there it was, the right turn at the end of the hallway. The extension corridor, the door marked 408A. My heart hammered against my ribcage as I approached the door looked older. Somehow the wood more weathered, the metal plaque more tarnished than I remembered. The air in the small hallway felt dense, resistant as if I were moving through water rather than air. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I reached for my phone to document what I was seeing. I activated the camera and began recording, narrating in a whisper that sounded strange and disconnected from my body. As I approached the door, the image on my phone screen began to distort. Vertical lines cut through the picture, and the audio became a staticky mess of white noise and discordant tones. When I touched the door, the screen went completely black, though the recording indicator showed it was still running. The handle felt ice. Cold against my palm set in a jolt of pain up my arm. It turned easily this time, and the door swung inward with no resistance. The opening revealed only darkness, not the absence of light, but a tangible darkness that seemed to absorb the hallway illumination at its edges. Standing at the threshold, I felt a pressure differential as if the space beyond the door was drawing air from the corridor. That's when I heard a sound from within the darkness. Not a voice, not machinery, but something between a whisper and the rustle of paper. It conveyed intention without words, awareness without presence. My skin erupted in goosebumps and a wave of nausea crashed over me. Every instinct screamed for retreat. I backed away, watching as the darkness seemed to seep around the edges of the doorframe like black smoke. The door remained open, an invitation or a threat I couldn't interpret. When my back hit the opposite wall, I turned and ran, not stopping until I reached the elevator. My hand shook so violently I could barely press the button for the lobby and the parking GEGE. I sat in my car for nearly an hour, trying to calm my racing heart and rationalize what I'd experienced. When I finally felt composed enough to drive, I checked my phone to review the video evidence. The recording was there, nearly 6 minutes long, but played back as visual static and a horrible screeching noise that forced me to mute my phone. The final frame showed what looked like elongated fingers reaching toward the camera before cutting to black. I told myself I needed verification. Confirmation from another person that what I was experiencing was real. The next morning, I returned to the building with James, a security supervisor I'd befriended during my assessments. I explained that I needed to check something on the 4th floor, but didn't elaborate on what we might find. As we walked the corridor together, I felt a creeping dread when we approached the end, as I feared and somehow expected the hallway terminated in the same blank wall I'd seen during my daytime visits. James looked at me with growing concern as I described the extension corridor in the office. 408A, I showed him the corrupted video, which now displayed nothing but black frames and produced no sound at all. He suggested gently that I might be overworked, that stress can cause perceptual distortions. I couldn't blame him for his skepticism, but his disbelief only deepened my isolation. Over the next 2 weeks, I visited the Harmon Business Center at different times, documenting when the mysterious extension appeared, and when it didn't, a pattern emerged. The corridor extension in office 408A were visible only after sunset and before sunrise. During business hours, the hallway always ended in a blank wall. No one else seemed to notice anything unusual about the 4th floor. I began researching the building's history, searching for any information about Office 4A or unusual occurrences on the 4th floor. The Harmon Business Center had been constructed in 1987 on the site of an older structure. The Harmon Medical Arts Building, which had been demolished after a fire archives from the local newspaper mentioned nothing unusual about either building. Though I did discover that the original structure had housed psychiatric offices last night. I returned to the building around midnight, determined to investigate Office 408A more thoroughly. I signed in with the night guard, who had grown accustomed to my odd hours, and took the elevator to the 4th floor as anticipated. The extension corridor and Office 408A awaited me at the end of the hallway. This time I came prepared with a digital recorder, a flashlight, and a small digital camera. In addition to my phone, all devices began malfunctioning as I approached the door. Batteries draining inexplicably, screens flickering, then going dark. The flashlight dimmed to a feeble glow that illuminated nothing standing before the door. I experienced that same sensation of heavy, resistant air and the subtle pulling feeling as if the space beyond the threshold was creating negative pressure. The door stood slightly ajar, this time, revealing a sliver of that absolute darkness within. I almost retreated, then almost turned and walked away, resolved to complete my assessment report without including the mysterious office. But professional pride and a growing obsession pushed me forward. I needed to understand what was happening. I needed to validate my experiences. I pushed the door open wider and directed my failing flashlight into the space. The beam didn't penetrate the darkness, rather. The darkness seemed to swallow it whole, but as my eyes adjusted, I began to perceive shapes within the blackness. The vague outlines of what might have been office furniture distorted and elongated as if viewed through warped glass, and there was movement, subtle shifts in the density of the darkness. Suggesting something circulating within the room, the air temperature dropped dramatically. My breath fogging before me as I stood at the threshold. That sound returned the whisper rustle I'd heard before, but now it formed patterns that almost resembled words. Logic insisted I should not enter, but I found myself taking a step forward anyway, crossing the threshold into office 408. The cold intensified, immediately burning my lungs with each breath. The door swung shut behind me with a soft click that sounded final, irrevocable in the absolute darkness. My sense of orientation vanished. I couldn't tell which direction faced the door, which way was forward or back. Then came the sensation of presence, not just one but many. I wasn't alone in that lightless void. Something moved past me, brushing against my arm with a touch that felt like dry paper. Another passed behind me close enough that I felt the displacement of air against my neck. My heart pounded so violently I feared it might rupture. The whisper rustle. Sounds converged, forming words I could almost comprehend. They seemed to emanate not from any particular direction, but from the darkness itself. I strained to understand, feeling that they were trying to communicate something of vital importance. That's when I saw it, a faint phosphorescent glow emanating from what appeared to be a desk at the center of the room. As my eyes adapted further, I could make out papers spread across its surface, glowing with their own pale light. I moved toward them, driven by a compulsion I couldn't resist. The papers contained architectural drawings of the Harmon Business Center, but with significant differences from the building I knew. Additional rooms, hidden passages, and altered dimensions filled the blueprints. Most notably, the fourth floor showed a much larger space where Office 408A should be a suite of rooms designated as special projects with no further explanation. As I examined the papers, I noticed dates in the corners. They weren't from the 1980s when the current building was constructed, but from 2031, 6 years in the future. My hands trembled as I tried to process this impossibility. The whisper rustle sounds intensified, becoming almost frantic in their rhythm. A sudden clarity struck me. Office 408. A existed. Outside normal temporal boundaries, it wasn't disappearing, and reappearing, it was phasing between different points in time. During business hours, it existed in another, when perhaps the past or future becoming accessible, only during the Leal night hours when the building's energy patterns shifted as this realization formed. The temperature in the room plummeted further. The papers on the desk began to curl and blacken at the edges. Though no flame was visible, the presences moving around me grew more agitated, their paper dry touches becoming more frequent, more insistent. I needed to leave now, but in the disorienting darkness, I had no idea which direction would lead to the door. Panic surged through me as I turned in place, searching for any indication of an X, yet my foot struck something solid, a chair or desk sending me stumbling forward. My outstretched hands met a solid surface, a wall. I ran my palms along it, searching desperately for a door handle. The whisper rustle, sounds coalesced into a single voice, still not quite human but clearly intelligible. Now it spoke 4 words that froze my blood. Not yet your time. My searching fingers found a metal doorknob. I twisted it frantically, throwing my weight against the door. It opened suddenly, sending me sprawling into the brightly lit main corridor of the 4th floor. The door to office 408E slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the walls. I lay on the carpet, gasping for breath, my body trembling uncontrollably when I finally managed to stand. I turned to look at the door and found only a blank wall, as if the extension Core in Office 408A had never existed. That was 3 days ago. I've submitted my assessment report for the Harmon Business Center, deliberately omitting any mention of Office 408. My supervisor has noticed my distracted state but attributes it to overwork. I've requested a transfer to residential assessments, citing a need for change after 15 years in commercial properties. But I know I'll return to the Harmon Business Center. The architectural drawings I saw in that darkness haunt my thoughts. What happens in 2031? What special projects will occupy that impossible space? Most troubling of all, I can't shake the certainty that I was meant to see those blueprints that whatever entities inhabit. Office 408A wanted me to know about the building's future. Sometimes when I'm alone in the silence of my apartment, I hear that whisper rustle sound again, faint but unmistakable, and occasionally from the corner of my eye, I glimpse movement. The shifting of shadows in a way that defies the physics of light. I've started avoiding mirrors after noticing that my reflection sometimes moves a fraction of a second too late. I don't know if I encountered something supernatural in Office 408A, or if the room represents some kind of temporal anomaly with a scientific explanation. What I do know is that whatever exists in that space recognized me, communicated with me, and for reasons I cannot fathom, released me. Not yet my time. It said the implication being that someday it will be beak. The first thing I noticed wasn't the silence, but its absence. The distant hum of traffic I'd been hearing for miles suddenly vanished, replaced by a vacuum so complete it made my ears ring. That's when I checked my GPS and found the screen frozen, not displaying an error, just stuck, as if time itself had stopped for everything except me and my aging sedan. I'd been driving for 3 hours when I decided to take that detour. Interstate 70 had become a parking lot, an accident ahead according to the radio, and my brother was expecting me for dinner. The clock read 4:37 p.m. The GPS adjusted a secondary route that would rejoin the highway past the congestion, so I took the next exit without hesitation. State Road 177 looked innocuous enough, a 2-lane asphalt ribbon cutting through dense woodlands. Nothing about it suggested what was to come. 20 minutes in, the trees grew thicker, pressing against the edges of the road. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy in fractured patterns that made my eyes strain to adjust between light and shadow. That's when my phone lost signal, a minor inconvenience. I told myself the GPS would still work offline, except it didn't. The blue dot representing my position remained stuck while the directional arrow spun uselessly. I maintained my speed, confident the road would eventually lead somewhere. Recognizable, that's when I noticed the first mileage sign, 177 South 23 Mill to Junction 40. Standard green reflective material, nothing unusual. 2 minutes later, another sign appeared, 177 South 25 miles to Junction 40. My foot eased off the accelerator had I misread the first sign. I shook my head and pressed on the next sign. Left no room for doubt, 177 South 28 miles to Junction 40. The distances were increasing. I was driving south, but somehow getting further from my destination, a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I checked my watch, 5:12 p.m. The afternoon sun should have been lower in the sky, but when I looked outside, the golden light appeared higher, more like mid-afternoon. My dashboard clock now read 3:47 p.m., nearly an hour earlier than when I'd left the interstate. I pulled onto the shoulder tires, crunching over gravel. The engine idled as I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. My breathing came in short, painful gasps, as if the air inside the car had thinned through the windshield. I watched the shadows cast by the trees gradually shrink and shift. Direction, the sun was rising in the west. 10 minutes passed, according to my watch. though the car clock now read 2:15 p.m. The forest had fallen into an unnatural silence. No birds, no rustling leaves. Despite the visible movement of branches in the wind, I felt a pressure in my ears like when descending in an airplane, except it wouldn't equalize. No matter how much I swallowed, followed fumbling with shaking hands, I tried restarting the car's infotainment system. The screen went black, then displayed the manufacturer's logo for an excruciating length of time before finally rebooting the clock, reset to 12 a.m. rings, then immediately jumped to 5:47 p.m. Later than when I'd started this journey. Something flickered in my peripheral vision, a dark shape moving between trees about 50 yards ahead, too large to be a deer, too fluid to be human. When I focused directly on the spot, nothing was there, but the sensation of being watched intensified until my skin prickled with goose flesh. I decided to turn around whatever strange phenomenon was affecting this stretch of road. I wanted no part of it. I shifted into drive and pulled back onto the asphalt, executing a careful three-point turn. The road behind me stretched empty and straight, far straighter than I remembered I could see at least a mile back, with no curves or hills to obscure the view. This wasn't the same winding road I'd been traveling. The fuel gauge caught my attention 3/4 full when I'd exited the interstate. Now hovering just above empty, the trip computer showed I traveled 187 miles since my last fill-up. Impossible, given that I'd only driven about 40 miles from home. My throat constricted as I accelerated north. The speedometer read 55 mech, but the trees passed by with unnatural slowness, as if I were crawling along at 20. My hands trembled against the steering wheel and a persistent throbbing had begun behind my right eye. I pressed harder on the accelerator, 65, 75-mile Piers. The engine strained and wind, but the landscape's passage remained eerily unhurried. A road sign appeared, 177. North 32M to Interstate 70. Hope surged briefly I was headed in the right direction, but the next sign less than a minute later read 177 North 35M to Interstate 70. The same impossible regression. My watch now read 6:30 p.m., while the car's clock showed 1:32 p.m. Outside, the light had shifted again, taking on the amber quality of late afternoon. The sun now hung where it should have been at that hour, but I couldn't shake the certainty that it had been in at least 3 different positions in the sky since I'd pulled onto this road. Something dark moved across the road about a 1/4 mile ahead. Not an animal, more like a smudge of shadow disconnected from any object capable of casting it. It slid across the asphalt with deliberate slowness before dissolving into the trees. I blinked rapidly, convinced my exhaustion was causing visual hallucinations. The radio suddenly crackled to life, though I hadn't touched its static at first. Then fragments of voices, not a clear broadcast, but snippets of conversations overlapping each other. I caught phrases, "should turn back now and they never leave." And most disturbingly, "he thinks he's still driving before I punch the power button." The voices continued for 3 more seconds before cutting out. My heart hammered against my ribs with such force I could see my shirt moving. My mouth had gone completely dry and the inside of my cheeks tasted metallic. Like blood without injury, the car felt simultaneously too small and too empty, as if the space behind me had expanded into an impossible void. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. A wooden sign appeared on the roadside, not a standard highway marker, but a hand-painted placard. I would have expected to see outside a rural business. Larson's Gas and Grocery, last stop for 60 miles. Below it in smaller letters as 1953, the paint looked fresh desperation and my near empty. Tent tank made the decision for me. I slowed as a small clearing appeared on the right, revealing a single-story clapboard building with 2 ancient gas pumps out front. The place looked like it had been plucked straight from the 1950s, down to the Coca-Cola thermometer hanging beside the front door. No other vehicles were visible. I pulled up to the pump and the gravel crunched under my tires with abnormal loudness in the stillness. When I shut off the engine, the abrupt silence felt like a physical presence pressing against my eardrums. My watch read 7:05 p.m. The car's clock displayed 4:37 p.m. Exactly the time I'd exited the interstate hours earlier. The station appeared operational. Lights glowed warmly behind the windows, but no one came out to attend the pump, and I saw no movement inside. I sat for 5 full minutes, unable to make myself open the door and step outside. Something about this place felt wrong, in a way I couldn't articulate, not abandoned, but waiting. I noticed a payphone attached to the side of the building, an anachronism in our cellular age, a lifeline. If I could call my brother, explain where I was, but even as the thought formed, I realized I didn't know where I was. Not really. The GPS had failed, the mileage signs contradicted themselves, and time itself seemed broken. A bead of sweat traced a cold path down my spine as I finally forced myself to exit the vehicle. The air outside felt thick and stagnant, like breathing through wet cotton. The temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees since I'd pulled over earlier. Though the sun still shone with late afternoon intensity, I tried the pump. First relieved when it activated with a mechanical clunk. After I lifted the nozzle, no card reader, this was the sort that ran continuously until you manually stopped it. The numbers spun on the analog display as I filled my tank. The gallons climbing improbably fast, considering how little room should have remained. 7 gallons, 10, 15, 18. The tank held 16 maximum. I pulled the nozzle out, but gasoline continued to pour from the spout onto the concrete, disappearing through cracks without cooling. I jammed the nozzle back into the pump housing and the flow ceased. The station door opened with a creak that raised the hair on my arms. A man stood in the doorway, tall, rail thin, dressed in what looked like a service station uniform from decades past. His face remained in shadow. Despite the sunlight that should have illuminated his features been driving long, his voice sounded wrong, like multiple voices speaking in near unison. With subtle delays between them, I managed to croak out a response asking where exactly this road LED. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, depends on where you're trying to go. He stepped forward and I stepped back. Involuntarily, his face came into view, ordinary features arranged in a slightly wrong way, as if someone had described a human face to an artist who had never actually seen one. Interstate, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I'm trying to get back to Interstate 70. The interstate, he repeated, drawing out the word. Sure, you just keep heading north about 10 minutes, you'll see the signs. His lips didn't quite sync with his words. I nodded, already retreating toward my car. What do I owe you for the gas on the house? He said, smiling now. Too many teeth in that smile. First-time visitors don't pay, the road brings us enough. He stepped back into the station before I could respond. The door closing with the same unsettling creak, I drove away with my hand slick on the steering wheel, accelerating harder than necessary. The station receded in my mirrors, then disappeared entirely when it should have still been visible on the straight road 10 minutes north. Just as he'd promised, I saw the interstate signs, the clock on my dashboard. Now read 5:52 p.m. My watch showed 7:32 p.m. The fuel gauge indicated a full tank. I merged onto Interstate 70 with a flood of relief. So intense it left me lie-headed normal traffic. Surrounded me cars, trucks all moving at predictable speeds. My GPS reactivated immediately. The robotic voice announcing I would reach my destination in 45 minutes. I had somehow bypassed half my journey. When I arrived at my brother's house, he greeted me with surprise, noting I was early despite the heavy traffic reported on the news. I checked the trip computer. It showed I'd driven 87 miles total. Exactly half the expected distance that night. Scrolling through my phone's photo gallery, I found images I didn't remember, taking blurry shots of empty road, the strange gas station, and one clear picture of a road sign, 177 South. Welcome back. I've taken the interstate exclusively since then, but sometimes when I'm driving alone at dusk, my GPS will suggest an alternate route, a quicker way to avoid traffic. The screen will flicker momentarily and I'll catch a glimpse of a road that isn't marked on any map, a road numbered 177, and sometimes in my rearview mirror, I see a service station attendant with too many teeth, watching and waiting for me to take that turn again. The mind plays tricks, they say, but what if the trick isn't in your mind at all, but in the fabric of reality itself? I discovered this terrible possibility on a Tuesday evening in October, sitting alone in my apartment surrounded by yearbooks and old photographs, my computer screen glowing with social media searches that yielded nothing. Absolutely nothing. My hands trembled as I ran them through my hair for the H-100th time, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. Despite the chill in the room, how could someone I spent nearly every day with for 3 years simply not exist? How could Marcos Alvarez, my closest friend during high school, have vanished not just from my life, but from existence itself? I remember him clearly, 6'2", wavy black hair that fell just above his shoulders, a small scar above his right eyebrow from a childhood accident involving his brother's bike, the way he'd crack his knuckles before every basketball game. A habit I found annoying but predictable. His laugh, a short explosive burst, followed by a wheezing sound when something really got him going. The smell of his mother's homemade empanadas that he'd bring for lunch occasionally and always share with me. These memories aren't vague. Impressions, they're vivid. Detailed recollections of someone I knew better than most of my family members. Yet here I was, 32 years old, staring at our senior yearbook, and Marcos wasn't in it. Not in our class photo, not in the basketball team picture where he'd been starting power forward, not in any of the candid shots from prom where we both gone stag and spent most of the night making fun of the couples on the dance floor in the basketball team photo, where I clearly remember Marcos standing behind me with his hands on my shoulders. There was instead a short blonde kid named Trevor whom I barely recall from math class. This discrepancy first occurred to me 3 weeks ago when my mother shipped me a box of my old high school memorabilia she'd found. While cleaning out the attic, among the items was a trophy our debate team won junior year. I distinctly remembered that tournament Marcos and I had prepared for weeks, staying up late at his house refining arguments, his father bringing us coffee at midnight, despite his mother's protests about seeing the moment we won. Marcos had grabbed me in a bee hug so tight I could barely breathe, whispering "We actually did it, man" in my ear with a voice thick with emotion, but the inscription on the trophy listed only my name and that of Sarah Martinez, a girl I certainly knew but had never partnered with for debate. When I called my mother to ask about this, her confusion was genuine. She'd never heard of Marcos Alvarez, maybe from college, she suggested, but no, I was certain he was from high school. I even described him to her, his height, his hair, the black leather jacket he wore nearly every day. Despite the Texas heat, nothing registered. I became obsessed with finding proof of his existence. I contacted old classmates through Facebook. Casual messages asking if they remembered Marcos from the basketball team or debate club, each response. Twisted the knife deeper, no one remembered him. Some suggested I might be thinking of Marcus Reynolds, a popular senior when we were sophomores, but that wasn't right. Others thought perhaps I was confusing high school memories with college ones, as my mother had suggested I dug out old papers from high school, convinced I'd find his name on group assignments or at least a mention in my own juvenile journals. Nothing I found a paper I specifically remembered writing with him. Our analysis of The Great Gatsby that earned us an A+ in AP English, but the paper showed only my name at the top. The rational part of my brain suggested there must be a simple explanation. False memories are a documented psychological phenomenon. Perhaps I'd created Marcos as a composite of several friends, or maybe there was a real Marcos but from a different period of my life and my mind had simply misplaced him in time. But these explanations felt hollow against the sheer volume and clarity of my memories. It was during this period of questioning that I began to notice strange occurrences around my apartment. At first they were subtle enough to dismiss a book out of place, a cup I didn't remember leaving on the counter, my keys on the hook when I thought I'd left them by the door. But as my search for evidence of Marcos intensified, so did these disturbances. One night I woke at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of basketball dribbling. Not from outside, not from a neighbor's TV, but from inside my living room. My mouth went dry instantly and I lay paralyzed as the rhythmic thump, thump, thump continued for exactly 47 seconds before stopping abruptly. The next morning I found nothing out of place, but the faint smell of gym sneakers lingered in the air. I installed a security camera in my living room that weekend. It recorded nothing unusual for the first few. Nights, though, I continued to hear sounds, whispered conversations just at the edge of comprehensibility, laughter that seemed to come from inside the walls, the creak of my couch as if someone had just sat down when no one was there. The camera captured none of this. Then on the fifth night, something changed. Reviewing the footage, the next morning I noticed a glitch at 3:17 a.m. The same time I'd heard the basketball dribbling days earlier, the video feed didn't cut out entirely, but the image warped, stretching and compressing as if seen through a heat mirage, and in that distortion for approximately 4 seconds, I could make out the silhouette of someone sitting on my couch. Someone tall with hair that fell to their shoulders. My heart hammered against my ribcage as I replayed those 4 seconds. Dozens of times, my fingers trembling so badly I kept missing the pause button. It wasn't clear enough to definitively say it was Marcos, but it wasn't clear enough to say it wasn't him either. What was clear was that someone or something had been in my apartment and my camera had barely captured it. I printed a still from the video, the blurry silhouette circled in red marker, and added it to my growing wall of evidence, a detective board worthy of any crime show, with sticky notes, string connections, and timeline markers. I was no longer just trying to prove Maro's heading existed, I was trying to understand what was happening to me. Now sleep became almost impossible each night. The disturbances grew more pronounced. The temperature in my apartment would drop suddenly in specific spots, cold enough that my breath would fog if I walked through them. Electronics malfunctioned, my TV turning on by itself to static my phone ringing with no caller ID and no one on the line. When I answered 3 times, I found handwritten notes in what looked like my own handwriting, but with messages I had no memory of writing. Remember the pizza place, check the roof, he's still watching. The pizza place referred to in the note had to be Go's a local joint where Marcos and I used to go after basketball games. It had closed years ago, but the building was still there. Now a vape shop, the roof that had to mean our high school roof where we'd sometimes sneak during lunch breaks to get away from the noise of the cafeteria. The last note, though, he's still watching that one, chilled me to the core because I'd begun to feel exactly that. Watched, it wasn't just paranoia, the hairs on the back of my neck would stand up. Suddenly reflective surfaces, windows at night, my bathroom mirror. Even the screen of my turned-off TV seemed to show movements just at the edge of my vision. Movements that disappeared when I turned to look directly. I began avoiding mirrors altogether, taking quick showers with my eyes fixed firmly on the tiles. My performance at work suffered. Colleagues noted my distraction, my bloodshot eyes, my startled jumps when someone approached my desk. Unexpectedly, my boss suggested I take some personal days concern evident in her voice. I agreed not because I wanted the time off, but because I needed to pursue this mystery with my full attention. With this newfound freedom, I drove to my old high school, arriving just as classes L out for the day. The building had been renovated since my time there, but the basic layout remained the same. I spoke to the front office, spinning a story about researching for a memoir, and asked if I could see past yearbooks. The secretary, an older woman with sympathetic eyes, led me to the library where archives were kept. I spent hours going through yearbooks, not just from my years, but from the years before and after as well. No Marcos, I expanded my search to club photos, sports teams from other seasons, candid shots in the hallways. Nothing according to these records. Marcos Alvarez had never attended Westlake High as I was leaving. Deflated and more confused than ever, I passed the trophy case in the main hallway. There among the sporting achievements and academic honors was our debate trophy. I pressed my face close to the glass, my breath fogging the surface as I read the inscription. My name and Sarah Martinez's just as on my copy at home. But as I pulled back, the reflection in the glass showed something that made my blood run cold over my shoulder. Just behind me stood a tall figure with shoulder-length dark hair. I spun around so quickly I nearly fell, but there was no one there. Just confused students giving the weird adult a wide berth as they hurried to their buses. The drive home was a blur. My hands shook on the steering wheel, and twice I had to pull over when I thought I saw someone in my back seat through the rearview mirror. By the time I reached my apartment, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes, gathering the courage to go inside the weight of what I'd seen or thought I'd seen pressing down on me like a physical force inside my apartment. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, yet somehow different. The air felt charged like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. I went straight to my evidence wall, staring at the blurry silhouette from my security camera. That's when I noticed something I'd missed before. A reflection in my TV screen, visible in the corner of the frame, a tall figure standing behind me as I slept on the couch. My legs gave out and I sank to the floor, my back against the wall. Eyes fixed on that image, the rational explanations I'd been clinging to evaporated. This wasn't false memory or misplaced nostalgia. Something was happening that defied conventional understanding. I grabbed my laptop with shaking hands and began typing everything I could remember about Marcos. Every interaction, every conversation, every shared experience. The words poured out of me in a frantic stream as if by documenting him thoroughly enough, I could somehow anchor him to reality. I wrote for hours, pausing only when my fingers cramped or when strange sounds from elsewhere in the apartment demanded investigation at 3:17 a.m. My laptop screen went black, not the gradual fade of a dying battery, but an instantaneous switch to darkness. In the reflection of the screen, I saw him, Marcos, standing behind me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. As he leaned down toward my ear, the voice that came was familiar yet distorted, as if speaking through water you weren't supposed to remember for me. I closed my eyes instinctively, my heart threatening to burst from my chest when I opened them again. My laptop screen had returned to normal, the document with all my memories of Marco still open, but there was new text at the bottom, text I hadn't written. Some things are forgotten for a reason, some people exist between worlds. I was your friend, but I was never supposed to be real by remembering me. You've torn something that shouldn't be torn. I'm neither here nor there now, and neither are you. I live with this knowledge now. I've stopped trying to prove Marcos existed to others or to myself. The disturbances in my apartment have ceased, but the feeling of being watched of, straddling some invisible boundary between realities, has become my constant companion. Sometimes in crowded places, I'll see him in my peripheral vision or sense his presence just behind me. I never turn to look anymore. My memories of Marcos remain vivid, but I've come to understand they occupy a space between truth and fantasy reality, and something else. Perhaps he was a visitor from another plane of existence who befriended me and then had to leave. Perhaps I somehow created him through intense loneliness, gave him form and substance through sheer force of will. Or perhaps there are glitches in reality itself, tears in the fabric that sometimes heal over erasing what should never have been. Whatever the truth, I know one thing with certainty. He remembers me too, and sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, that's the most terrifying thought of all. Anil, to the human mind, is adept at creating patterns from randomness, at finding faces in the static. But what happens when the pattern finds you? When the static watches back, I used to be certain about the boundary between imagination and reality. Now I'm not so sure. It began on a Tuesday night in late October when the darkness seemed to swallow more than just the light. I've always been the last to leave the office. Baxter & Sons Financial Consulting occupies the 5th floor of the Westridge Commercial Complex, an aging building that stands isolated at the edge of an industrial park, surrounded by nothing but empty lots and the occasional storage facility 5 miles from the nearest residential area. It's the kind of place that empties completely after business hours, leaving behind only the hollow echo of fluorescent lights and the distant hum of the highway. That night I had stayed later than usual, caught in the labyrinth of quarterly reports that demanded immediate attention. By the time I shut down my computer, the digital clock on my desk read 11:42 p.m. The cleaning crew had come and gone hours ago, leaving behind the chemical scent of industrial disinfectant that always made my sinuses burn as I gathered my belongings. The silence pressed against my eardrums like cotton wool. The building had settled into that peculiar stillness that seems to amplify every small sound. The tick of the wall clock, the distant gurgle of pipes, the soft whisper of air through vents. I remember thinking how different a place becomes when humans vacate it, as if the walls themselves exhale. Once we're gone, the elevator ride down to the lobby was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling that the car descended slower than usual, as if reluctant to deliver me to the ground floor when the doors finally parted. The security guard's desk sat empty. Jerry usually worked until midnight, but his chair was vacant, a half-empty coffee cup. The only evidence of his presence, I called out his name, but my voice merely bounced off the marble floors and died in the corners of the lobby. I shrugged it off. Perhaps he was making his rounds or had stepped outside for a cigarette. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped into the night. The air was unseasonably cold, carrying the metallic scent of approaching rain. The parking lot stretched before me, a vast expanse of cracked asphalt, illuminated only by scattered lampposts that cast pools of sickly yellow light at uneven intervals. My car, a gray Honda Civic that had seen better days, was parked in the farthest corner, a habit I developed to prevent door dings and scratches from careless coworkers. The walk to my vehicle usually took less than 2 minutes, but that night it felt longer. Perhaps it was the unusual silence or the way the wind had suddenly died, leaving the air unnaturally still about halfway across the lot. I noticed something, or rather someone, standing near my car. A man tall and thin, dressed in what appeared to be a dark suit. He stood perfectly still, facing the building I had just exited. Even from a distance, something about his posture seemed wrong, too. Rigid, too perfect in its stillness, no shifting of weight from foot to foot, no subtle movements of the head or shoulders that betray the presence of life. My pace faltered for just a moment before I forced myself to continue walking. My keys clutched tightly in my right hand, the jagged edge of my car key protruding between my knuckles. A defensive measure I'd learned in a self-defense class years ago. I kept my eyes fixed on my destination, trying to project an air of confidence. I didn't feel the logical part of my brain offered rational explanations. A fellow employee working late, someone waiting for a ride, a lost driver seeking directions. Yet with each step, the hollow pit in my stomach expanded. The figure remained motionless, and as I drew closer, I realized I couldn't make out his features. His face seemed to exist in a pocket of deeper shadow, as if the darkness clung to him more densely than to the surrounding night. 20 feet from my car, a chill shuddered through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. It started at the base of my spine and crawled upward, branching out along my ribs and settling at the nape of my neck. Where the fine hairs stood at attention, I forced myself to breathe evenly to maintain my pace. I was being ridiculous. This was just some guy in a parking lot. Nothing more. I angled my approach to give the figure a wide berth, fishing my key fob from my pocket and unlocking the car from a distance. The responding flash of headlights briefly illuminated the scene, but the man remained a silhouette, his features indiscernible as I reached my vehicle. I risked a quick glance in his direction. He hadn't moved, hadn't turned. Still faced the building, still stood with that unnatural stillness. But something had changed. Something subtle that I couldn't immediately identify. Then it hit me. His shoulders seemed higher, his back straighter as if he was now alert. Aware of my presence, I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors immediately. My hands trembling slightly as I inserted the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered once before roaring to life, and I cranked the heater to combat the sudden chill that had settled into my bones out of habit. I glanced at the rearview mirror to check for traffic before backing out. He was there behind my car, looking directly at me. My heart slammed against my ribcage, and I twisted in my seat, looking through the rear window. The parking space behind me was empty. Nothing but asphalt and paint-painted lines confused. I turned back to the mirror. He stood there no more than 10 feet away, his face still obscured, but his body now angled toward my vehicle. Impossible. I whipped my head around again, scanning the entire area behind my car. Nothing. No one yet when I looked at the mirror once more. There he was, closer now, perhaps 7 feet from my bumper. Panic surged through me like an electrical current. I threw the car into drive and pressed the accelerator tires, squealing as I pulled away from the parking space. My hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel as I navigated toward the exit, checking all mirrors obsessively each time I looked at the rear view. He was there always at the same distance, moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped, yet never visible. When I turned to look directly, I sped through the parking lot, taking the corner near the security booth too quickly, feeling the car list dangerously to one side before the tires found their grip. Again, the exit gate was up unusual for this time of night, as it typically lowered automatically after 10 p.m. Requiring an employee key card to open, I didn't question this. Stroke of luck, accelerating through the opening and onto the main road only when I was a mile away. With the glow of the highway visible ahead, did I allow myself to take a deep, shuddering breath. My shirt clung to my back, soaked with cold sweat, and my jaw ached. From clenching it so tightly, the rational explanations began to assert themselves again, a trick of the light, an overtired mind. Conjuring images from shadows, perhaps even the early stages of a migraine affecting my vision. By the time I reached my apartment 20 minutes later, I had almost convinced myself that nothing unusual had occurred. Almost, I parked in my assigned space, gathered my briefcase, and hurried inside, double-checking the deadbolt after closing the door behind me. I didn't sleep well that night, startling awake at every creak of the building, settling every distant car door closing in the lot below. Morning brought clarity and embarrassment in the harsh light of day. My fear seemed childish, a product of working too many hours and watching too many late-night horror movies. I showered, dressed, and headed to my car, determined to put the strange episode behind me. That's when I saw them on the driver's side of my Honda, starting near the front wheel. Well, and continuing to the back door, handprints or something like handprints elongated with fingers that seemed too thin, too jointed. They weren't made of dirt or dust, as one might expect. Instead, they appeared as dry patches on the metal, as if all moisture had been extracted from those precise areas, leaving behind a dull, almost oxidized finish in the shape of hands. I stood staring at these marks, my briefcase slipping from suddenly numb fingers and landing with a thud at my feet. A maintenance worker passing by asked if everything was all right. I managed to nod, mumbling something about bird droppings on my car. He gave me an odd look before continuing on his way. I picked up my briefcase, unlocked my car, and drove to work on autopilot. My mind racing with possibilities, none of them comforting. The workday passed in a blur. I found myself staring at the clock, dreading the moment when the office would empty, when darkness would reclaim the world outside. I made excuses to leave early, citing a dental appointment that didn't exist. As I walked to my car at 4:30 p.m., I scrutinized every shadow, every reflective surface. The handprints remained unmistakable in the afternoon sun. I drove straight to a car, was feeding bills into the automated machine. With trembling fingers, I watched through the windshield as jets of water and soap assaulted my vehicle from all sides, scrubbing brushes working methodically over every surface. When the cycle finished and I pulled out of the bay, I immediately checked the side of the car. The handprints remained untouched by water soap or mechanical brushes. Over the next week, I became obsessed with removing these marks. I tried specialized cleaning products, then a clay bar treatment. Recommended by a detailing enthusiast online, when these failed, I resorted to more desperate measures. Steel wool that should have scratched the paint, but somehow left no mark on the handprints. Then a small electric sander borrowed from my neighbor. Nothing affected those dry patches. They remained a perfect record of something's touch, something's claim. I began leaving work while the sun was still high, developed a sudden interest in carpooling with colleagues. Invented reasons to have my vehicle serviced at shops far from my usual mechanic. I avoided looking in my rearview mirror whenever possible, and when necessity demanded it, I held my breath, half expecting to see that figure standing behind my car, watching waiting sleep, became elusive. My nights fragmented by jarring dreams where I drove endlessly down dark roads, the figure always visible in my mirror no matter how fast I drove or how sharply I turned. I would wake gasping sheets twisted around my legs, the phantom sensation of cold fingers on the back of my neck. 2 weeks after the initial incident, exhaustion had worn my nerves raw. I sat at my desk staring blankly at a spreadsheet that had long since lost its meaning when my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Jerry. "The night security guard left your briefcase at security desk. Last night can hold until tonight." I frowned at the message. I hadn't been to the office the previous night, and my briefcase sat beside my desk where I'd placed it that morning. I typed back a quick response, explaining the confusion, then returned to my work. Minutes later, my phone buzzed again. "Sorry for mix-up, gentleman who left it said he was you, tall guy, thin dark suit, very formal. Said you'd be back for it." The blood in my veins turned to ice water. I stood abruptly, my chair rolling back and colliding with the cabinet behind me. My coworkers glanced up at the noise, their expression shifting from surprise to concern as they took in my pallor. My wide eyes, the visible tremor in my hands. I fabricated an explanation about a family emergency and left immediately, ignoring the worried queries that followed me to the elevator in the parking garage beneath the building. I approached my car, cautiously examining it from every angle before unlocking it. The handprint seemed darker somehow, more defined, as if whatever had left them was pressing harder, becoming more substantial with each passing day. That night, I checked into a hotel 20 miles away, using cash and a name that wasn't mine. I left my car in long-term parking at the train station and took a cab, watching the side mirror obsessively during the entire ride. In my room, I pushed a heavy dresser against the door, closed the blackout curtains, and sat on the edge of the bed, my back against the headboard, a lamp on either side casting away the shadows around 3 a.m. Exhaustion finally overcame vigilance, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. I'm not sure how long I slept before a noise jolted me awake, a soft rhythmic tapping like fingernails on glass. I lay perfectly still, listening, trying to identify the source. The tapping continued, patient, unhurried. My eyes were drawn to the bathroom door, which stood slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond as I watched the door begin to swing open. Slowly, silently, the tapping stopped. From the darkness of the bathroom emerged a hand, long-fingered, pale, with joints that bent at unnatural angles. It gripped the edge of the door, the knuckles bulging beneath papery skin. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. The hand was joined by another, then the suggestion of shoulders, the hint of a head. I squeezed my eyes shut, reciting in my mind that this wasn't happening, couldn't be happening. When I opened my eyes again, sunlight filtered through the edges of the curtains. The bathroom door was closed. I approached it carefully, heart hammering in my chest, and flung it open to reveal nothing but ordinary fixtures, shower, sink, toilet. No sign of an intruder, no evidence of the nightmarish vision. I checked out immediately, returning to my apartment only long enough to pack essential items before driving to my sister's house in the next state. I told her I was having work done on my place, a convenient lie she accepted without question. For 3 days, I experienced something close to peace. My car remained unmarked. The handprints had vanished during my absence. I began to wonder if perhaps the entire episode had been a manifestation of stress, a temporary break with reality brought on by overwork and isolation. On the 4th morning, I stepped outside to retrieve the newspaper from my sister's driveway. A car was parked across the street. My car, my Honda Civic, which should have been sitting in my sister's garage where I'd left it the previous evening. As I stared in disbelief, I noticed movement in the driver's seat. Someone sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel. I crossed the street slowly, as if in a trance. The driver's window was rolled down, the seat was empty, but in the rearview mirror I could clearly see a reflection. A man in a dark suit staring back at me as I watched, frozen in place. His lips pulled back in what might have been a smile, revealing teeth too numerous, too sharp. The mirror showed his hand reaching toward me, long fingers extending beyond what should have been physically possible in reality. If such a concept still applied, nothing was there, just empty air, and the growing certainty that whatever boundary exists between the world of reflections and our own had become permeable. At least for him, I backed away, then turned and ran back to the house. I've been here for 2 days now, writing this account, trying to make sense of what's happening. My sister thinks I'm ill, has suggested doctors, therapists, even a short stay at a facility where I can rest. She doesn't understand that rest is impossible. Now that closing my eyes means seeing him standing beside my bed, watching, waiting. Last night, I covered every reflective surface in my room, the television screen, the window glass, even the face of my wristwatch. I lay in darkness, listening to the sounds of the house settling to my sister's soft snoring from the next room to the distant passing of cars on the main road. Just before dawn, my phone lit up with a notification, a text message from my own number. Look at your hand? I didn't want to. Every instinct screamed against it, but my eyes betrayed me. Dropping to my left hand, which rested atop the blanket. There, spread across my palm and extending to my wrist, was a handprint, dry, desiccated skin in the exact shape of long-jointed fingers. As I stared in horror, the mark began to spread, the moisture being pulled from my flesh as if by some unseen force, the pattern extending up my forearm. I don't know what he wants. I don't know why he chose me, but I know now that no distance will be sufficient. No hiding place secure enough. He exists in reflections and mirrors in the spaces just beyond direct sight, and he's patient. So very patient. I catch glimpses of him everywhere now in store windows, as I pass in the chrome finish of elevator doors in the black screen of my phone before it lights up. Always watching, always waiting for what I still don't know, but I suspect with growing certainty that sooner or later I'll find out the FL. Lights in our office never fully die, they simply decay. Hour by hour, their buzzing grows more insistent while their illumination dims, creating shadows that shift and stretch across empty desks. This gradual degradation of light is something you only notice when you're the last one left. When the building settles into that hollow quietness that makes every creak, every distant hum of the elevator machinery, every tick of the wall clock feel like a secret being whispered directly into your ear. I've worked countless late nights at Meridian Analytics, but it wasn't until 6 weeks ago that I realized these weren't the only sounds keeping me company. After hours, I'm a data analyst at a small financial consulting firm located on the 14th floor of an aging office building. Downtown, our space is modest. A reception area, 8 cubicles, a conference room, and 2 private offices. One belonging to Robert Mercer, the founder and managing partner. Mercer is demanding, but fair, the kind of boss who expects excellence but acknowledges hard work. He's methodical, always following the same routines, arriving precisely at 7:30 a.m., leaving at 6:15 p.m., and wearing the same style of charcoal suit with different colored ties to denote the day of the week. Tuesday is always navy blue, Wednesday is burgundy. His predictability became a comforting constant in my otherwise chaotic life. That night, I was hunched over spreadsheets cross-referencing orderly projections for a major client presentation. The following morning, the office had emptied 2 hours earlier. Mercer himself had left around 4, mentioning something about his daughter's piano recital. I remember checking my watch 9:42 p.m. and calculating how much longer I would need to finish the analysis. That's when I heard it, my name called out from the hallway leading to the conference room. Daniel, the voice, was unmistakably Mercer's. That distinct beret one with the slight southern draw he picked up during his years at Vanderbilt. The inflection was peculiar, almost like a question and a statement. Simultaneously, I responded automatically, asking if he needed the preliminary numbers. The sudden sound of my own voice hanging in the empty office made me realize how strange it was that Mercer would be back. I pushed away from my desk, the wheels of my chair squeaking against the laminate flooring. The hallway was empty. The motion sensor lights flickered on as I stepped into the corridor, revealing nothing but closed doors and the water cooler. Bubbling quietly in the corner, I called out again, my voice sounding smaller than before. No response. I checked the conference room. Mercer's office, even the small kitchen area and bathroom. Nothing. I rationalized that perhaps I had misheard something, the building's old pipes, the elevator machinery, or maybe even someone on another floor. Logical explanations existed. They had to back at my desk. I had just resumed work when the office phone rang, its shrill tone shattering the silence. The caller ID displayed Mercer's home number. My hand hesitated above the receiver for a moment before picking up Mercer's voice came through the line, inquiring about the status of the Davidson report. What froze the blood in my veins wasn't the content of his question, but the intonation identical to what I had heard in the hallway minutes earlier. The same questioning inflection, the same subtle draw elongating the second syllable of my name. I managed to respond coherently, assuring him the report would be ready by morning. Throughout our brief conversation, my eyes remained fixed on the empty hallway, half expecting to see a figure materialize where the voice had originated. After hanging up, I sat motionless, listening intently to the ambient sounds of the office. The fluorescent light above my desk flickered rhythmically, casting intermittent shadows across my keyboard. I could have left then, should have. Instead, I convinced myself it was a coincidence. Perhaps an echo in the building's ventilation system had carried fragments of an earlier conversation. Perhaps stress and exhaustion were playing tricks on my perception. Rational explanations existed, but in the following days the incidents multiplied. Each occurrence followed the same pattern. I would hear Mercer's voice in the office shortly after he had physically left the building, followed by an actual communication from him from another location. Sometimes it was a phone call, sometimes a text or email, but always with the same vocal patterns or writing style. I had just heard in the empty office the phenomenon wasn't limited to my name being called. Once I heard what sounded like Mercer discussing quarterly projections with someone in the conference room, complete with the distinctive way he tapped his pen against the table. For emphasis, when I investigated, the room was dark and unoccupied. 20 minutes later, he sent a company-wide email outlining the exact same points about the quarterly forecast. My colleagues noticed the change in my behavior. How could they not? I began to flinch at sudden sounds, to stare too long at empty spaces. I installed a small mirror on my monitor to watch the area behind me. My work suffered as I spent increasing amounts of time analyzing patterns when Mercer left. Where I heard the voice, what was communicated, and when the actual communication followed, I mapped it all in a spreadsheet, searching for correlations for any data point that might explain what was happening. According to my calculations, the time between hearing the voice and receiving the actual communication from Mercer was decreasing. Initially, it had been minutes, then seconds. I began to fear the moment these events would occur simultaneously. What would it mean when the echo arrived at the same moment as the source? Sleep became elusive. When I did manage to drift off, my dreams were filled with voices emanating from empty rooms, calls that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. I began to record everything, setting up my phone to capture audio whenever I was alone in the office. Most recordings picked up nothing but the ambient sounds of the building, but occasionally there it was. Mercer's voice, faint but distinct, saying words I would later receive in an email or hear in a phone conversation. I shared my concerns with no one. How could I explain that something in our office was anticipating my boss's communications, that something was replicating his voice with perfect accuracy before he even spoke? The words from wherever he actually was, the rational explanations grew thinner, more implausible. With each occurrence, 4 weeks into this nightmare, I decided to stay late, specifically to confront whatever was happening. I positioned myself in the central area of the office after everyone had left waiting for Mercer's voice. The air conditioning hummed softly, punctuated by the occasional ping from the elevator down the hall. Sweat bead along my hairline. Despite the cool air, my throat felt constricted, my mouth dry as paper at precisely 7:43 p.m. It came not from the hallway this time, but from directly beside Mercer's office. Need to revive the Blackwood proposal. The numbers don't add up. The voice was so clear, so present, that I could almost feel the breath that should have carried those words. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached Mercer's office. The door was closed. The light off my hand trembled as I gripped the handle, turned it slowly, and pushed the door open. The office was empty, bathed in the dim glow from the city lights. Filtering through the blinds, I stepped inside my shoes. Silent against the carpet, nothing seemed disturbed. Mercer's desk was organized as always, laptop-gone pens arranged by color, family photo angled precisely toward his chair. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Mercer: need to revise the Blackwood proposal. The numbers don't add up. Can you take another look tonight, word for word? Inflection for inflection. If text could carry such a thing, I stumbled backward out of his office. My spine connecting with the wall behind me, the impact knocked a framed company award askew as I reached to straighten it. I noticed something I had never paid attention to before, a small vent in the ceiling, part of the building's central air system. The following day, I arrived early and examined every inch of the office. I discovered similar vents positioned throughout the space, all connected to the central HVAC system that serviced the entire building. An idea began to form, not a rational explanation, but something adjacent to one. I researched architectural acoustics, how sound travels through buildings, how certain structures can create anomalous acoustic effects. I found cases of acoustic mirrors where the unique architecture of a space could capture sounds and reproduce them elsewhere. Under specific conditions, none of it fully explained what I was experiencing, but it provided a framework. However tenuous to cling to that. Evening, I stayed late again, this time with a different purpose. When everyone had gone, I systematically moved through the office, carefully placing small pieces of duct tape over the vents, not blocking them entirely, but changing their acoustic properties. I felt ridiculous, like a man constructing a tinfoil hat, but desperation had overtaken my sense of self-consciousness. I returned to my desk and waited hours past without incident. My shoulders had just begun to relax when the sound came, Mercer's voice discussing third-quarter projections. But this time it was different. The voice sounded distorted, as if speaking through water. More importantly, it came from everywhere at once, reverberating throughout the office rather than from a specific location. My skin prickled with goosebumps as I realized the voice wasn't coming from the vent at all. The tape had merely changed how it manifested. I sat frozen, listening as the voice continued for nearly 30 seconds before fading away. My phone remained silent. No email appeared for the first time. There was no corresponding communication from the real Mercer. I waited another hour before giving up and heading home. My mind racing with possibilities. Had I somehow disrupted the pattern? Had I made things worse? The answer came the next morning when I arrived at work. There was a strange energy in the office. Colleagues huddled in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. Our receptionist informed me that Mercer wouldn't be in today. He had been hospitalized overnight. After experiencing what doctors suspected was a transient ischemic attack, a mini-stroke, he had collapsed while working on quarterly projections at home. The timing aligned perfectly with when I had heard the distorted voice over the subsequent days. A terrible hypothesis formed in my mind. What if the voice I heard wasn't an echo of Mercer's actual communications? What if it was something else entirely, a precursor, a preview of thoughts not yet expressed? What if by disrupting the acoustic properties of our office, I had somehow interfered with whatever natural process was occurring? Mercer returned to work the following week, seemingly recovered but noticeably subdued. The doctors had found nothing conclusive, attributing his episode to stress and overwork. He appeared thinner, paler, his voice slightly weaker than before. I removed the tape from the vents when no one was looking. That same day, I began to hear the voice again, clear, precise, and always preceding Mercer's actual communications. But now I listened with new understanding. I wasn't hearing an echo, I was hearing a forecast. The voice wasn't replicating Mercer's communications. After he left, it was anticipating them before they were ever spoken. This realization should have terrified me more than anything that had come before. Instead, it brought a strange calm. I had glimpsed something beyond ordinary understanding. A wrinkle. In the fabric of reality, where causality folded back upon itself, I still work late at Meridian Analytics. I still hear the voice, but now I understand my role as witness to something inexplicable yet somehow essential. I've become attuned to the subtle differences between Mercer's actual voice and its predecessor. The latter slightly more resonant, as if emerging from somewhere deeper than a human throat. Sometimes when I'm alone in the quiet office, I speak into the empty air, wondering if my own voice creates ripples elsewhere. If someone in another place might hear me before I've spoken, the building listens. The vents carry my words away, and somewhere in the space between what will happen and what has happened, something receives them. The lights continue to flicker, the office continues to breathe, and in the silence after everyone is gone, I wait for voices that shouldn't exist, carrying messages not yet sent from a future still forming PR. I still feel it sometimes, that peculiar numbness that creeps from my jaw and spreads across my face like spilled ink on paper. It wasn't the typical dental anesthetic that wears off in hours. This sensation returns periodically, always at night, always when I'm alone, accompanied by the subtle metallic taste that floods my mouth. And when it happens, I know with absolute certainty that what I experienced was real. Despite all evidence to the contrary, the pain started on a Tuesday. A dull throb that originated somewhere deep in my mur and gradually intensified until it became impossible to ignore. By Wednesday morning, the side of my face had swollen, and focusing on work became an exercise in futility between whys. I mentioned my predicament to Davis, a colleague I knew only through brief interactions in the break room. Not someone I typically seek advice from, but desperation has a way of lowering standards. Davis's eyes lit up with unexpected enthusiasm. He scribbled an address on a post-it note, slid it across the table, and assured me that this dentist had performed miracles on his impacted wisdom tooth. Last year, the location seemed unusual. Some office building in Havenbrook, a neighborhood on the outskirts of town where development had stalled after the economic downturn. I'd rarely ventured there, but the pain pulsing through my jaw eliminated any hesitation. That afternoon, I called in sick for the remainder of the day and drove across town. The roads grew narrower as I navigated through Havenbrook, passing shuttered storefronts and apartment complexes with more vacancy signs than occupied units. Fall had descended early that year, and a thin layer of mist hung over the streets, softening the edges of buildings and blurring traffic lights into hazy orbs. The address led me to a 10-story commercial building with a facade of smudged glass and weather-stained concrete. Unlike the surrounding decay, this structure maintained a peculiar dignity, as if existing in defiance of its deteriorating neighborhood. Inside, the lobby smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. A directory board with missing letters displayed the building's occupants: law offices, accounting firms, a travel agency that likely hadn't booked a vacation since the internet took over, and there it was. Nightingale Dental Ass Associates, Sweat 8113. The elevator ascended with mechanical reluctance, each floor marked by a subtle jolt. When the doors finally slid open on the 8th floor, I stepped into a hallway that stretched in both directions, lined with identical brown doors and illuminated by fluorescent lights that hummed like trapped insects. Suite 8113 waited at the end of the corridor past several vacant offices with darkened windows. I hesitated at the door, my pain momentarily eclipsed by an inexplicable apprehension. Something about the building's emptiness, the echo of my footsteps on the tiled floor, the peculiar stillness of the air. It all felt wrong somehow, but the throbbing in my jaw quickly reminded me why I had come. The dental office defied my expectations. Behind that unremarkable door lay an immaculate reception area with soft lighting and comfortable furniture. The walls were painted a soothing shade of blue, adorned with framed landscapes of serene mountain vistas. Soft classical music drifted from concealed speakers. The contrast with the dreary hallway outside was so stark that crossing the threshold felt like stepping into another world entirely. A receptionist looked up from her computer and smiled. Her face was pleasant but somehow forgettable, as if deliberately designed not to leave an impression. She checked my name against an appointment book, though I didn't recall making an appointment, and informed me with practice deficiency that Dr. Nightingale could see me immediately. The waiting room remained empty save for myself, yet magazines were fanned out on side tays as if recently disturbed by other patients. She directed me down a short hallway to examination room 3. The dental chair faced a window overlooking the city, though the view seemed oddly unfamiliar from this vantage point, as if the building were taller than I had initially perceived. Dr. Nightingale entered moments later, his movements fluid and precise, his handshake firm but cold. His features were sharp and angular, high cheekbones, prominent jawline, deep-set eyes that reflected the overhead lights like polished obsidian. He examined my infected tooth with such gentle precision that I barely felt his instruments probing. The sensitive area, his diagnosis came swiftly: an abscess, requiring immediate drainage followed by root canal therapy. The procedure could be performed right away, he assured me, his voice carrying a slight accent. I couldn't quite place something European, perhaps, or possibly Canadian, softening the consonants in a way that made his words sound almost melodic. I should have asked questions about insurance, about credentials, about how Davis had found this place instead. I nodded eagerly, desperate for relief. The injection of anesthetic brought immediate numb spreading beyond the typical boundaries of dental work creeping down my neck and across my shoulder. Dr. Nightingale worked methodically, his movements becoming increasingly blurred as whatever he had administered took stronger. Hold the ceiling above me, transformed under my drug-hazed gaze. The fluorescent panels seemed to pulse and shift, revealing glimpses of something else behind them, intricate patterns that appeared almost organic, like the branching of veins or the spread of roots. The classical music warped subtly, individual notes stretching beyond their natural duration. I tried to focus on the cityscape through the window, but even that had changed. Buildings standing at impossible angles against a sky that had deepened to an unnatural indigo. Despite the early hour, Dr. Nightingale spoke occasionally, his words reaching me as if through water. Something about exceptional conditions, about rare anatomical anomalies, about my tooth being particularly interesting. I felt pressure but no pain as he worked, and despite my growing unease, I remained perfectly still, my body no longer responding to my mounting anxiety. The procedure ended abruptly. Dr. Nightingale stepped back, removed his gloves with a crisp snap, and pronounced the treatment complete. The receptionist returned, helped me to my feet. When it became clear my balance was compromised, and provided aftercare instructions printed on heavy cream-colored paper with an elegant letterhead I was to return in 7 days for a follow-up assessment. The numbness would subside within hours. She assured me, though certain sensations might persist longer due to the nature of the treatment. I left the building in a daze, the setting sun casting long shadows across the parking lot. The drive home remained a blur, in my memory marked by wrong turns and near misses at intersections that night. I slept deeply and dreamlessly, waking the next morning with only a dull ache where the fierce pain had been. The week passed. Uneventfully, the infection appeared to have cleared, and I returned to work. Mentioning my successful treatment to Davis in passing, he nodded, distractedly immersed in a spreadsheet, and made no acknowledgement of his recommendation. I attributed his lack of response to workplace stress and thought nothing more of it. On the 7th day, I returned to the building for my follow-up appointment. The lobby looked shabbier than I remembered, the floor tiles cracked in places, dust gathering in corners. The directory board showed no listing for Nightingale Dental Associates, confused. I approached the security guard stationed behind a desk I hadn't noticed during my previous visit. According to him, there had never been a dental office in the building, certainly not in the last decade he'd worked there. Suite 813, he informed me with growing impatience, had been vacant since the previous tenant. A small accounting firm had gone bankrupt 3 years earlier. I insisted I had been there just 1 week ago, but my protests only earned me suspicious glances and eventually a suggestion that I might want to check my records again, determined to prove I wasn't losing my mind. I took the elevator to the 8th floor. The hallway appeared narrower, darker, and considerably more dilapidated than I remembered. Emergency lights cast a jace glow over peeling wallpaper and stained carpet. Suite 81's door was secured with a heavy padlock rust accumulating around its edges. Through the clouded glass panel, I could make out an empty room with dust-covered floors and water stains spreading across the ceiling like invasive mold. It clearly hadn't been occupied for years. My heart raced as I pressed my face against the glass, desperately searching for any sign of the immaculate office I had visited. The taste of metal filled my mouth, and my recently treated tooth began to throb. And for perfect synchronization with my pulse, I stumbled back from the door, my reflection in the glass momentarily transforming into something unfamiliar. Sharper features, deeper set eyes, a smile that stretched too wide back at work. The next day, I confronted Davis about the referral. He looked at me with genuine confusion, then concern. As I described the mysteriously vanished dental office, he swore he had never given me an address, had never recommended at a dentist, and suggested with the careful tone people use when they fear someone might be unstable, that perhaps I should consider talking to someone professional about my experience. I tried to forget the incident, to rationalize it as some bizarre episode triggered by pain medication or stress, but certain details continued to haunt me. The way the cityscape from the window hadn't matched any possible view from the building's actual height and position, the unnatural coldness of Dr. Nightingale's hands, the peculiar letterhead on my aftercare instructions, which I could no longer find, despite tearing apart my apartment in search of them. 3 weeks later, I noticed something when flossing a small hard object lodged in the gum beside my treated tooth using tweezers. I carefully extracted what appeared to be a sliver of metal, no larger than a grain of rice, under my bathroom light. It gleamed with an unusual luster, neither silver nor gold, but something in between, inscribed with markings too tiny to decipher without magnification. That night I dreamed of Dr. Nightingale standing over me, explaining in his melodic accent that certain patients were selected for special procedures, that my dental anatomy made me an ideal candidate for their experimental work in the dream. He opened his own mouth to reveal teeth modified with the same metallic substance, arranged in patterns that seemed to shift and reconfigure. Even as I stared at them, I woke with a jolt. The familiar numbness spreading across my face in the bathroom mirror. I examined my tooth, now aching dully. The gum around it had receded slightly, revealing what appeared to be a thin line of the same metal embedded at the base of the tooth. I ran my tongue over it, tasting copper and something else, something chemical and foreign. Over the following months, I consulted 3 different dentists. Each examined my tooth and found nothing unusual. Just a standard root canal and crown performed with adequate if unremarkable skill. X-rays showed normal bone structure and no foreign objects. One dentist, more patient than the others, gently suggested that phantom sensations following dental work were not uncommon, particularly for patients with anxiety disorders, but I know what I felt, what I still feel when the numbness returns on random nights accompanied. Now, by brief bursts of what seemed like transmitted thoughts, clinical observations, Dr. Nightingale's voice descriptions of successful integration, mentions of subjects responding well to initial implantation, I've developed new habits. Since then, I avoid dentists entirely. I check and recheck the addresses of any medical professionals before visiting them. I've installed a small ultraviolet light in my bathroom, which I use nightly to examine my tooth, because under that specialized illumination, the crown emanates a faint pulsing glow that no natural material should produce. Sometimes I drive past that building in Havenbrook, parking across the street to watch the 8th floor. Windows, mostly they remain dark, but occasionally, briefly always late at night, lights flicker in Suite 813, casting angular shadows that move with unsettling precision. I've never worked up the courage to enter the building during these episodes. Part of me fears finding nothing but that empty, dusty room again. A great G part fears finding Dr. Nightingale waiting for me. Instruments prepared for my next treatment. The small metal object I extracted sits in a glass vial on my nightstand. Sometimes it seems to shift position overnight, though I tell myself this is impossible. Twice, I've tried to show it to others, but on both occasions the vial appeared empty when I attempted to display it, only to reveal its contents again when I was alone. Last week I noticed Davis looking at me strangely across the office. When our eyes met, he touched his jaw in exactly the spot where my treated tooth is located. Then smiled a smile that stretched slightly too wide, revealing teeth that caught the fluorescent lights with an unnatural gleam. He hasn't acknowledged the gesture since responding with blank confusion when I carefully asked if his dental work had been done locally. I know how this sounds. I understand why no one believes me, but something happened in that dental chair in Suite 813. Something. Beyond conventional explanation, something was placed inside me, or perhaps something was awakened and it remains there still pulsing beneath the artificial crown, sending its signals to recipients. I can only guess at the most terrifying aspect isn't the possibility that I imagined everything. It's the growing certainty that I didn't, and the question of how many others like me are out there carrying these small metallic seeds behind their perfect smiles, waiting for whatever harvest Dr. Nightingale and his associates have planned tonight. My tooth is throbbing again through my bathroom window. I can see the lights of the city and somewhere among them the building in Havenbrook. I wonder if Suite 8113 is illuminated now. If Dr. Nightingale is bending over another patient, installing another piece of his puzzle, I wonder when I'll receive the signal to return.